Before we begin tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference for us as well. And if you want, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. And if you enjoy these deep dives into history's mysteries, please subscribe. Tonight's story comes from a suggestion by Dogface680, and we cannot thank you enough for this idea. This is one of the most compelling conspiracy theories rooted in actual Cold War history. And what makes it so haunting is how much of it is documented fact. What you're about to hear sounds impossible. A 4-star general, a war hero, the man who helped liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny, dead in a hospital bed just months after victory, following a minor car accident that shouldn't have killed anyone. No autopsy, no investigation. Medical records vanished, witnesses disappeared, and decades later, a former intelligence operative steps forward with a confession that changes everything. This is the story of General George Smith Patton Jr., the man who won the war but lost the peace, the general who believed he had fought in past lives alongside Alexander the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte, who believed in destiny and glory and refused to be silent when silence was demanded. This is the story of his mysterious death, and the conspiracy theory that suggests the greatest threat to George Patton wasn't the Nazi Wehrmacht, it was his own government. December 9th, 1945. Near Mannheim, Germany. The war is over. Europe lies in ruins. Cities reduced to rubble. Railways destroyed. Bridges collapsed. Millions dead. Millions more displaced. The Third Reich, which promised to last 1,000 years, lasted 12 and ended in a Berlin bunker with a gunshot. Victory belongs to the Allies, and General George Smith Patton Jr., the most aggressive, most decorated, most controversial American commander of World War II, sits in occupied Germany with nothing left to conquer. He is 60 years old. His hair is silver. His face is weathered from years of command in the Mediterranean sun, the French countryside, the German winter. He wears his pearl-handled revolvers on his hips, relics of an earlier era when generals still led cavalry charges. He looks like something from another century, and in many ways he is. Patton believes he fought at the walls of Troy. He believes he rode with the Romans into Carthage. He believes he charged with Napoleon at Austerlitz. Past life memories, he calls them. Visions of ancient battles that feel more real than dreams. His officers think he's eccentric. His soldiers think he's touched by God. His enemies learned not to think about him at all until it was too late. But now, in December 1945, Patton is no longer commanding armies. He is no longer shaping strategy. He is no longer needed. The Third Army, which he led across France and into the heart of Germany, has been reassigned. His new command is a paper organisation with no soldiers, no tanks, no mission beyond compiling reports that no one will read. He is waiting to go home, and he is angry. That morning, December 9th, Patton wakes before dawn in his quarters at Bad Nauheim, a spa town north of Frankfurt that serves as headquarters for what remains of his command. He eats breakfast alone, as is his custom. Eggs, toast, coffee. He reviews intelligence reports from the Soviet occupation zone. He reads dispatches from Washington. He writes in his diary, the leather-bound journal he has kept since West Point, filling page after page with his cramped handwriting. Today's entry is bitter. They have sidelined me. Eisenhower fears what I might say. The politicians fear what I might do. The Soviets fear I might be right. So here I sit, a relic, while Europe burns. He signs his name with a flourish, as always. George Smith Patton Jr., 4 stars, Third Army. At 9:30 in the morning, he receives word that a pheasant hunting expedition has been arranged for that afternoon. It's one of his few remaining pleasures, a brief escape from the tedium of meaningless command. His Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay, will accompany him. They'll take one of the staff cars, drive south toward Mannheim, spend a few hours in the countryside. It should be routine. At 11 o'clock, Patton descends the stairs of his headquarters building. His boots echo on the marble floors. Officers snap to attention as he passes. He returns their salutes mechanically, his mind already elsewhere, already planning the afternoon hunt, already thinking about the estate where the pheasants run wild. Outside, a Cadillac Model 75 sedan waits. Black paint, chrome trim, the kind of vehicle befitting a general officer. The driver stands beside it, a young private first class who has been assigned to Patton's detail for less than 2 weeks. This is the first irregularity. Patton's regular driver, a sergeant named John Mims, who had driven him for 3 years through combat and occupation, was transferred on December 1st. No explanation was given. Mims, interviewed decades later by researchers, said the transfer was sudden and unusual. He was given orders to report to another unit immediately. He never drove for Patton again. The replacement driver's name is in the accident report, but researchers have never been able to locate his service records. The man seems to have vanished from military documentation after December 9th. Patton climbs into the back seat. General Gay joins him. The driver starts the engine. They pull out of the headquarters compound and onto the road leading south. It's a cold morning. Frost covers the fields. The sky is grey, low clouds threatening snow. The roads are in poor condition, still cratered from the fighting, still littered with debris from the bombardment that reduced Mannheim to ruins earlier in the war. Traffic is light, a few military trucks, some civilian vehicles, German citizens walking along the roadside, bundled against the cold, their faces hollow with hunger and defeat. Patton watches the landscape pass. He has driven these roads dozens of times. He knows every turn, every checkpoint, every landmark. At approximately 11:45, near a railroad crossing on the outskirts of Mannheim, the car approaches an intersection. A United States Army truck, a 2.5-ton vehicle painted olive drab, approaches from a side road. What happens next takes 3 seconds. The truck makes a sudden left turn, cutting directly across the path of Patton's Cadillac. The driver of the Cadillac swerves right, tyres skidding on the frost-slicked pavement. The vehicles collide, the sound of metal against metal, the crunch of breaking glass, the hiss of steam from a ruptured radiator, and then silence. The driver of the Cadillac climbs out, shaken but uninjured. General Gay opens his door, checking himself for injuries. Nothing. A few bruises, perhaps. Nothing serious. He turns to check on Patton and sees him slumped in the back seat, conscious but unable to move. "My neck," Patton says quietly. "I think my neck is broken." Within minutes, military police arrive. Within an hour, Patton is on his way to Heidelberg. Within days, the official story begins to fracture under the weight of its own inconsistencies. And within 12 days, George Smith Patton Jr. is dead. Chapter 1. The General Who Became a Problem. To understand why conspiracy theories surround Patton's death, you have to understand who Patton was in the final months of his life, and more importantly, what he represented to the emerging Cold War order. George Smith Patton Jr. was never meant for peacetime. He was born into a military family in California in 1885. His grandfather fought for the Confederacy. His father was a politician. Young George grew up hearing stories of cavalry charges and desperate last stands, of honour and glory and the warrior's code. He attended the Virginia Military Institute, then West Point. He competed in the Stockholm Olympics in 1912, finishing 5th in the modern pentathlon. He served under General John Pershing in Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa through the desert. He commanded tanks in World War I, was wounded in combat, came home with a chest full of medals and a reputation as a fighter. Between the wars, he studied. He read military history obsessively. Caesar, Alexander, Hannibal, Frederick the Great, Napoleon. He believed war was an art form, that great commanders were born, not made, that destiny selected certain men for greatness. He believed he was one of those men. When World War II came, Patton was ready. He commanded American forces in North Africa, in Sicily, in France. His Third Army swept across Europe faster than anyone thought possible. His tactics were aggressive, sometimes reckless. He believed in speed and shock and overwhelming force. He believed hesitation killed more soldiers than enemy fire. His methods worked. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied commander. They repositioned entire divisions based on intelligence about Patton's location. They assumed wherever Patton was, the main attack would follow. Often, they were right. But Patton was more than just a brilliant tactician. He was also politically tone-deaf, personally abrasive, and constitutionally incapable of diplomacy. He slapped shell-shocked soldiers in field hospitals, calling them cowards. He gave speeches praising the fighting spirit of the German army. He made jokes about the Holocaust that appalled other officers. He criticised Allied strategy in press conferences. He feuded with British commanders. He defied orders when he thought they were stupid. Eisenhower protected him during the war because Patton won battles. But when the war ended, Patton became expendable. More than that, he became dangerous. Because Patton refused to accept the post-war order. May 8th, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. Allied leaders meet in Potsdam to negotiate the peace. Europe is divided. The Soviet Union takes the east, America and Britain take the west. Borders are redrawn, governments are installed, millions of people are displaced, moved, relocated to fit the new map. Patton watches this happen and sees betrayal. The Allies, he argues, fought to liberate Europe from tyranny. Now they're handing half of Europe to Stalin, a dictator as brutal as Hitler, a regime as totalitarian as the Nazis. He makes this argument publicly. In June 1945, Patton gives a speech in Los Angeles comparing the Soviet Communist Party to the Nazi Party. He calls both totalitarian threats to freedom. He suggests the Allies defeated the wrong enemy, that Germany should have been turned against the Soviet Union instead of being destroyed. The backlash is immediate. Politicians demand his resignation. Newspapers condemn him. The War Department issues official reprimands. President Truman, already dealing with the complexities of Soviet relations, is furious. Eisenhower summons Patton to his headquarters. The meeting does not go well. Eisenhower and Patton were friends once. They rose through the ranks together, served together between the wars, understood each other. But the war changed them both. Eisenhower became a political general, a coalition builder, a man who understood that winning the peace required compromise and patience. Patton remained a warrior who believed wars should be fought without hesitation and won without apology. In Eisenhower's office, Patton is told his public statements are unacceptable. He is ordered to stop criticising Soviet policy. He is warned that further incidents will result in his removal from command. Patton argues back. He presents intelligence reports about Soviet violations of ceasefire agreements. He describes forced population transfers, summary executions, political purges. He insists someone needs to tell the American people what's happening in occupied Europe. Eisenhower tells him that someone is not going to be Patton. The conversation ends badly. Within weeks, Patton is relieved of command of the Third Army and reassigned to the 15th Army, a paper organisation with no operational role. His job now is to compile lessons learned from the European campaign, to write reports analysing tactics and strategy for future military planners. It's a desk job. To a man like Patton, it's worse than death. Internal War Department memos from this period reveal the thinking behind the reassignment. One memo describes Patton as politically dangerous and increasingly uncontrollable. Another warns that Patton's celebrity status among soldiers and veterans makes him a potential political threat to current foreign policy initiatives. A third memo, written by a senior intelligence officer, suggests that Patton's return to the United States should be delayed indefinitely to prevent him from influencing public opinion regarding Soviet intentions. These memos were classified for decades. When they were finally released under Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1980s, they revealed something important. By October 1945, senior American officials viewed Patton not as an asset but as a liability, and they were actively working to neutralise him. Chapter 2. The Diaries and the Warnings. General Patton kept meticulous diaries throughout his military career. These weren't casual journals. They were detailed historical records, written in his own hand, documenting everything from tactical decisions to personal reflections. He wrote almost every day, sometimes for hours, filling leather-bound volumes with his cramped, precise handwriting. He believed history would vindicate him. He wanted his perspective preserved for future generations. After his death, the diaries were collected by his family. Some entries were published in biographies, others remained private for decades. Some have never been fully released, held back by the Patton family estate for reasons never publicly explained. But the entries that have been made public from October and November 1945 paint a disturbing picture of a man who believed he was being watched, controlled, and silenced. October 2nd, 1945. Patton attends a meeting with Soviet officers to coordinate occupation zones. The meeting is tense. The Soviets refuse to cooperate on prisoner exchanges. They deny Allied access to certain territories. They claim violations of ceasefire agreements that Patton knows are fabricated. He writes, "The Russians are impossible. They lie about everything. They're worse than the Nazis and no one wants to admit it. Eisenhower orders me to maintain diplomatic relations. I'd rather maintain my rifle aimed at their headquarters." October 15th, 1945. Patton inspects Soviet troop positions along the occupation zone boundary. He notes their equipment, their readiness, their disposition. What he sees alarms him. He writes, "Soviet forces are not demobilizing. They're repositioning. They have combat units forward deployed, supply lines established, logistics prepared for offensive operations. If we have to fight them, and I believe we will, we should do it now while our armies are still here, still equipped, still ready. In 2 years, we'll have nothing in Europe, and they'll have everything." October 23rd, 1945. Patton meets with German civilians, former Wehrmacht officers, refugees fleeing Soviet occupation. They tell him stories of mass arrests, forced labour, summary executions, entire villages emptied. He writes, "We promised these people freedom. We told them we were liberating them from tyranny. Now we're handing them to Stalin, who is every bit as brutal as Hitler. The only difference is Stalin is our ally, so we pretend not to see what he's doing. History will judge us harshly for this betrayal." October 31st, 1945. Patton submits a request for extended leave to return to the United States. He wants to visit family, rest, recover from years of combat command. He also wants to speak freely, away from military censorship about what he's witnessed in Europe. The request is denied by the War Department. No explanation is provided. He writes, "They want me here where they can watch me, where they can control what I say, where I can't reach the American people. I understand their game now." November 7th, 1945. Patton has lunch with a journalist from the New York Herald Tribune. The interview is supposed to be off the record, a background briefing about post-war Europe. Patton speaks candidly about Soviet intentions, about Allied failures, about the need for American military readiness. 2 days later, the journalist contacts Patton. The interview has been killed by editors. Someone from the War Department called the newspaper and asked that the story not run. The journalist is apologetic but clear. The article will not be published. Patton writes, "Even the press is controlled now. The truth is too dangerous for the American people to hear. They want everyone to believe we won the war, and everything is fine now. But nothing is fine. Everything we fought for is being given away, and anyone who points this out is silenced." November the 19th, 1945. Patton receives notice that his security detail is being changed. His regular driver, his aides, his bodyguards, men who have served with him for years are being reassigned. New personnel are being assigned to replace them. The official reason is routine rotation of personnel. Patton doesn't believe it. He writes, "They're putting watchers around me, new people who report to someone else. I recognise the pattern. I've used it myself in our intelligence operations. When you want to monitor someone, you put your own people next to them. I'm being treated like a security threat in my own command." November 25th, 1945. Patton's wife, Beatrice, writes him from the United States. She's worried about him. His letters have become dark, paranoid. He writes about being watched, about feeling trapped. She asks if he's well. He writes back, but his response never makes it into his diary. Later, Beatrice told biographers that Patton's letter frightened her. He wrote that he was planning to return home soon, and caused them a lot of trouble. He wrote that he intended to speak publicly about Soviet aggression and Allied failures. He wrote that he knew this would end his military career, but he didn't care anymore. He wrote, "Some fights are worth the cost." December 1st, 1945. Patton's regular driver, Sergeant John Mims, is abruptly transferred to another unit. Mims has driven Patton for 3 years through North Africa, Sicily, France, Germany. He knows Patton's habits, his routes, his preferences. He's loyal, competent, trusted. The transfer happens overnight. Mims is given orders to report immediately to a quartermaster unit in Belgium. He's not allowed to say goodbye to Patton. A new driver is assigned, a young private first class who's been in the European theatre for less than 3 months. Patton writes, "Even my driver is replaced now. They're not even being subtle about it anymore." This is Patton's last diary entry. 8 days later, he's in the car accident. Chapter 3. The collision that changed everything. December the 9th, 1945. Late morning. General Patton's Cadillac sedan leaves his headquarters in Bad Nauheim at approximately 1100 hours. The sky is overcast, threatening snow. Temperature is just above freezing. The roads are slick with frost but passable. Patton sits in the back seat. He's dressed in his uniform, wearing his leather jacket against the cold. His pearl-handled revolvers are on his hips. He carries a walking stick, an affectation from his days of cavalry service. Major General Hobart Gay sits beside him. Gay has served as Patton's chief of staff throughout the war. He's one of Patton's few remaining friends in the High Command, one of the few officers who still speaks to him regularly after his controversial statements. The new driver, whose name appears in the accident report as Private First Class Horace Woodring, sits behind the wheel. He's nervous. He's only driven for Patton a handful of times. He's not familiar with the General's preferences, his habits, his routes. The drive should take less than an hour. They follow the main road south from Bad Nauheim, through small German towns still recovering from the war. Mannheim was one of the most heavily bombed cities in Germany. The RAF and American 8th Air Force dropped thousands of tons of explosives on its industrial districts. Much of the city centre was destroyed. Rebuilding has barely begun. The roads through Mannheim are in poor condition. Craters from bombs, debris from collapsed buildings. Some streets are still blocked entirely, forcing detours through unfamiliar routes. At 11:43, according to the accident report, Patton's Cadillac approaches a railroad crossing on the outskirts of Mannheim. The area is semi-rural, factories mixed with farmland. Traffic is light. A United States Army truck, identified in the report as a GMC 2.5-ton cargo vehicle, approaches from a side road on the left. According to the truck driver's statement, taken by military police at the scene, he did not see the Cadillac approaching. He claimed the sun was in his eyes, though the day was overcast. He claimed he was unfamiliar with the intersection, though the road was clearly marked. He claimed he made the turn at normal speed, though witnesses said the truck accelerated suddenly. The Cadillac's driver swerves right to avoid impact. Too late. The vehicles collide at the intersection. Now here's where the official story begins to fall apart. The collision is low speed. The Cadillac is travelling approximately 35 miles per hour. The truck is travelling approximately 15 miles per hour. The impact is glancing, not head-on. The Cadillac's front passenger side strikes the truck's rear cargo area. The damage is minor. The Cadillac's front bumper is bent. The headlight is broken. The hood is dented. The truck's rear panel is scraped but intact. Both vehicles remain operational. The Cadillac's driver, Private First Class Woodring, is uninjured. He has a small bruise on his hand from the steering wheel. Nothing else. Major General Gay is uninjured. He experiences momentary shock from the impact, but suffers no physical trauma. The truck driver is uninjured. He climbs out of his cab without assistance. General Patton, sitting in the back seat of the Cadillac, suffers catastrophic injuries. According to the initial medical assessment, Patton was thrown forward in the collision. His head struck a metal partition or support structure in the car's interior. The impact caused acute cervical spine trauma, specifically a comminuted fracture of the third cervical vertebra and a vertical fracture of the fourth cervical vertebra. The injury results in immediate complete paralysis from the neck down. Multiple forensic analysts who examined the case decades later noted severe inconsistencies with this explanation. First, the injury pattern. A forward impact of the type described should cause predictable trauma. Facial injuries, chest contusions, possibly head trauma. The passenger would hit the seat in front of them, the back of the driver's seat, which is padded. Instead, Patton sustained a precise cervical fracture with no facial injuries, no chest trauma, no head contusions. Second, the biomechanics. For Patton to strike the partition with enough force to fracture his cervical spine, he would need to be travelling at significant speed relative to the car's interior. But the collision was low speed, and Patton was seated wearing his heavy leather jacket, which would have provided some padding. Third, the other passengers, both the driver and General Gay, sitting in front of Patton, experienced minimal impact forces. Gay later described the collision as a solid bump, nothing more. Yet Patton, behind them, experienced forces sufficient to break his neck. One forensic pathologist who reviewed the case in the 1990s suggested the injury pattern was more consistent with a direct blow to the back or side of the neck, the kind of trauma that might result from being struck by a hard object, rather than from impact with a car's interior. Another analyst noted that the specific fracture pattern, comminuted fracture of cervical 3, vertical fracture of cervical 4, is relatively rare in motor vehicle accidents, but more common in cases of direct trauma to the posterior neck. Without an autopsy, without X-rays beyond the initial hospital films, without detailed forensic analysis, these observations remain speculative. But they raise questions. Then there's the matter of the truck driver. According to the accident report, the driver was interviewed by military police at the scene. He provided a statement describing the collision. He was cited for failure to yield. He was released. His name appears in the report as Private Robert Thompson. No unit is listed. No serial number is recorded. No permanent address is given. Researchers have spent decades trying to locate Private Robert Thompson. Military personnel databases have no record of anyone by that name serving in the European theatre in December 1945. The truck's serial number, listed in the accident report, corresponds to a vehicle assigned to the Quartermaster Corps. But when historians tried to trace the vehicle's movement logs, maintenance records, and assignment history, they found nothing. The truck existed on paper, but vanished from all documentation after December 9th. The military police who responded to the scene should have filed detailed reports, taken photographs, secured evidence. Standard accident investigation procedure, especially for a collision involving a 4-star general. No photographs were ever released. The military police reports were classified, then reported lost. No physical evidence from the scene was preserved. Within hours, the Cadillac was repaired and returned to the motor pool. The truck disappeared entirely. And Private Robert Thompson was never seen again. Chapter 4. 12 days in Heidelberg. The Heidelberg Army Hospital in December 1945 was one of the finest medical facilities in Europe. It had treated thousands of wounded soldiers during the war. It had experienced trauma surgeons, skilled nurses, modern equipment for 1940s medicine. The hospital specialised in combat injuries, including complex trauma cases that required intensive care. Spinal injuries like Patton's were rare but not unprecedented. The medical staff understood the protocols: immobilisation, prevention of secondary injury, monitoring for complications, physical therapy when possible. Patton arrived at the hospital at approximately 1300 hours on December 9th, less than 90 minutes after the accident. He was conscious, alert, able to speak. He described the accident to doctors. He reported complete loss of sensation and movement below his neck. He remained calm, even joking with the medical staff. "I've been closer to death than this before," he told one nurse. "I'll be fine." Initial X-rays confirmed the cervical fractures. Neurological examination confirmed complete paralysis below the level of injury, but the attending physicians were cautiously optimistic. The fractures, while severe, showed no signs of spinal cord transection. There was hope that with proper immobilization and time, some nerve function might return. Complete recovery was unlikely, but partial recovery was possible. Patton was placed in skull traction, a device that immobilized his head and neck to prevent further injury. He was given oxygen support. His vital signs were monitored continuously. Nurses attended him around the clock. On December 10th, one day after the accident, Patton's condition appeared stable. His vital signs were strong. He was communicating with staff. He showed no signs of infection or complications. On December 11th, Patton's wife Beatrice arrived from the United States. The Army had arranged emergency transport, flying her across the Atlantic on a military aircraft. She was escorted by senior officers who had worked to expedite her travel. When she entered Patton's room, he smiled. "I'm in a hell of a fix this time," he told her. She sat beside his bed and held his hand. He couldn't feel it, but the gesture mattered. For the next few days, Patton's condition remained stable. Doctors noted slight improvement in some reflexes. There was cautious talk of eventual transfer to a specialized facility in the United States. Physical therapy was discussed. Patton himself remained optimistic. He made plans. He talked about recovery. He joked about getting back to work. On December 13th, 4 days after the accident, Patton's condition began to change. He developed a slight fever. His breathing became more laboured. Doctors suspected early pneumonia, a common complication in paralysed patients who cannot cough effectively to clear their lungs. Antibiotics were administered. Oxygen support was increased. On December 14th, the fever worsened. Patton's oxygen saturation dropped. His breathing became increasingly difficult. The medical staff worked to keep his airways clear, but the paralysis made it nearly impossible for him to assist in his own treatment. On December 15th, 6 days after the accident, Patton's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. He developed severe pulmonary edema, fluid accumulation in the lungs. His heart rate became irregular. His blood pressure fluctuated wildly. The doctors diagnosed acute heart failure, possibly triggered by a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had travelled from his immobilised legs to his lungs. Emergency treatment was initiated, but Patton's condition continued to deteriorate. Over the next 6 days, he slipped in and out of consciousness. The fever persisted. The pulmonary edema worsened. His heart struggled to maintain adequate circulation. On December the 21st, 12 days after the accident, at 1750 hours, General George Smith Patton Jr. died. The official cause of death, pulmonary embolism and congestive heart failure secondary to his injuries. The death certificate was signed by the attending physicians. The hospital issued a statement expressing condolences. The Army notified next of kin. Flags were lowered to half-staff, and then the irregularities began. First, no autopsy was performed. This is unusual for several reasons. Patton was a 4-star general, one of the most prominent military figures in American history. His death under medical care, with unexpected complications arising rapidly, would normally warrant a thorough post-mortem examination. The official explanation was that the family declined an autopsy. But Beatrice Patton later disputed this claim. In interviews with biographers, she stated she was never asked about an autopsy. She said the Army simply informed her that her husband's body would be prepared for burial and that no autopsy was necessary or planned. She said she didn't question the decision at the time. She was grieving, exhausted, overwhelmed. She trusted the military doctors who told her Patton died of natural complications from his injuries. Only later did she wonder why they were so insistent that no autopsy be performed. Second, Patton's complete medical records from Heidelberg Hospital were never released to the family. Beatrice requested the files multiple times over the following years. She wanted to understand what happened to her husband, why he declined so rapidly, whether everything possible had been done to save him. Her requests were denied. The Army told her the medical records were classified for reasons of operational security. She was told the files contained sensitive information about medical procedures and treatment protocols that could not be disclosed. She never received the records. When historians and researchers sought the files decades later under Freedom of Information Act requests, they were told the records were missing. Some reports claim the files were destroyed in the 1960s per routine document retention policies. Other reports claim the files were lost when Heidelberg Hospital closed. Still other reports claim the files are held in classified archives but remain restricted. No one has seen Patton's complete medical records since December 1945. Third, several members of the medical staff who treated Patton were transferred shortly after his death. One surgeon was reassigned to a hospital in Japan. A nurse was transferred to a facility in England. The hospital administrator retired from military service within weeks of Patton's death. When researchers tried to interview these individuals in later years, most declined to participate. Some claimed they couldn't remember details of Patton's case. Others said they were bound by military confidentiality, even decades later. One physician agreed to an interview but died before it could be conducted. One nurse who worked in Heidelberg Hospital during December 1945 gave a brief interview to a researcher in 1976. She described unusual activity in the days before Patton died. She mentioned restricted access to Patton's room. She said only certain staff members were allowed to enter. She described visitors who came late at night, men in military uniforms who weren't logged in the visitor registry. She mentioned medical procedures that weren't part of standard treatment protocols. She said Patton received injections she didn't recognise, medications that weren't listed on his chart. When the researcher pressed for details, the nurse became vague and uncomfortable. She ended the interview abruptly and refused further contact. She died 2 years later. No additional interviews were ever conducted. Fourth, the timeline of Patton's decline doesn't match typical post-injury progression. Spinal injury patients certainly face complications. Pneumonia is common because paralysed patients cannot clear their lungs effectively. Blood clots are common because immobilised patients cannot move their limbs. Heart failure can occur due to the stress of injury and prolonged bed rest. But the speed and severity of Patton's decline struck some medical experts as unusual. One pulmonologist who reviewed the case in the 1980s noted that Patton went from stable and communicative to critical and dying in less than a week. While complications can arise quickly, the progression described in the available documentation seemed unusually rapid for a patient receiving intensive care in a modern facility. Another physician, a toxicologist, reviewed the symptoms described in newspaper reports from December 1945. Sudden pulmonary edema, cardiac arrhythmia, rapid deterioration. He noted these symptoms could result from injury complications, but they could also result from certain poisonous substances. Specifically, he mentioned digitalis toxicity, which causes cardiac complications and pulmonary edema, and would be difficult to detect without specific toxicology screening. Without an autopsy, without tissue samples, without toxicology analysis, there's no way to confirm or deny such theories. But the possibility exists, and that possibility, combined with all the other irregularities, fuels the conspiracy theory that Patton didn't die from his injuries. He was killed. Chapter 5. The OSS operative's confession. For more than 30 years, the official narrative of Patton's death remained unchallenged. Tragic accident, medical complications, natural death given his injuries. Historians wrote biographies portraying Patton as a brilliant but troubled commander whose life ended in unfortunate circumstances. Filmmakers made movies celebrating his military genius while depicting his death as a sad footnote to a legendary career. His death was accepted as tragic but unremarkable. And then, in 1979, everything changed. An 84-year-old man named Douglas DeWitt Bazata walked into the office of a military historian working on a book about the Office of Strategic Services. Bazata said he had information about General Patton's death, information that had been classified for more than 3 decades, information that, if true, would rewrite history. Douglas Bazata was not a conspiracy theorist. He was not a fringe figure seeking attention. He was a legitimate war hero, with verifiable credentials and a documented history of service in America's wartime intelligence apparatus. Born in 1911, Bazata grew up in Pennsylvania and joined the Marine Corps in the early 1930s. He served in various capacities until the outbreak of World War II, when he was recruited by the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency. The OSS conducted some of the most sensitive operations of the war: espionage, sabotage, assassination, support for resistance movements, operations that couldn't be acknowledged publicly and whose details remain classified even today. Bazata operated behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. He conducted sabotage operations against Nazi infrastructure. He organised partisan resistance networks. He gathered intelligence that helped Allied forces plan operations. His service record is documented in declassified OSS files. His decorations include the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and various foreign awards from governments he aided during the war. He was not a man prone to fantasy or fabrication, and he said he had killed George Patton, not personally, not directly, but as part of an operation ordered by senior American intelligence officials. According to Bazata, in late November 1945, he was approached by a high-ranking OSS officer. Bazata declined to name this officer publicly, saying only that he held a senior position in intelligence operations and had authority to order field operations without political oversight. The officer told Bazata that General Patton had become a problem. Patton's public criticisms of Soviet policy were undermining Allied unity at a crucial moment. The Cold War was beginning. The Yalta Conference had established a delicate balance between the United States and Soviet Union. American intelligence agencies were working to establish networks in Eastern Europe, networks that required Soviet cooperation, or at least Soviet tolerance. Patton's rhetoric threatened all of it. His threats to return to the United States and speak publicly about Soviet aggression could turn American public opinion against cooperation with Stalin. His celebrity status among soldiers and veterans gave him a platform that could shape national policy. The officer told Bazata that political leadership had decided Patton needed to be silenced, permanently. Bazata claimed he refused at first. He argued that Patton was right about the Soviets, that someone needed to speak the truth about Soviet intentions. The officer told him this wasn't about truth. It was about stability. It was about maintaining diplomatic relationships long enough to establish American interests in post-war Europe. It was about preventing a premature confrontation with the Soviet Union that America wasn't ready to fight. The officer told him it was a matter of national security, and national security justified any action. Bazata claimed he was not directly involved in arranging the car accident. He said that aspect of the operation was handled by others, specialists in staged accidents and traffic collisions, but he confirmed the accident was not accidental. The truck driver, he said, was an operative, possibly OSS, possibly another agency. The collision was planned and executed as a way to remove Patton without raising suspicions of foul play. But the accident wasn't supposed to kill Patton. It was supposed to injure him seriously enough to prevent him from returning to the United States and speaking publicly. A career-ending injury that would sideline him while appearing accidental. The neck fracture was a bonus, ensuring Patton would never command again. But then Patton started to recover. Within days of the accident, doctors were talking about possible rehabilitation, about eventual transfer to the United States, about Patton potentially regaining some function. That wasn't acceptable. According to Bazata, the decision was made to finish the operation in the hospital. He claimed he was part of a team that had access to Heidelberg Hospital. They posed as medical staff or military visitors. They gained access to Patton's room, and they administered a substance that would trigger the complications that killed him. Bazata wouldn't specify what substance was used. He suggested something that would cause cardiac and pulmonary complications consistent with his injuries, something that would be difficult to detect without specific toxicology screening, something that would appear as natural progression of his condition. He said Patton died believing he was succumbing to his injuries, never knowing he was being murdered. Bazata claimed the operation was compartmentalized. Only a handful of people knew the full scope. The operatives involved were told only what they needed to know. Records were destroyed or classified. Witnesses were silenced through transfers, retirement, or more permanent means. He said Soviet intelligence was aware of the operation. They tacitly approved because Patton's anti-Soviet rhetoric was creating problems for Stalin as well. But the Soviets were not directly involved. This was an American operation for American reasons. He said the decision came from senior levels of American intelligence, possibly with approval from political leadership, though he had no direct evidence of White House involvement. He said he had stayed silent for more than 30 years out of loyalty to his country and fear of retaliation against himself and his family. But now, in his 80s, with most of the principals dead, he wanted the truth known. He wanted history to record what actually happened. Bezzeta's confession was explosive. The researcher who first interviewed him was sceptical, but as Bezzeta provided details, as he named other operations he had participated in, as he described OSS procedures and protocols that matched declassified documents, the researcher began to believe Bezzeta was telling the truth, at least telling what he believed to be the truth. The researcher published a book in 1981 that included Bezzeta's claims. The book created immediate controversy. Historians dismissed Bezzeta as a fabricator. The CIA, successor to the OSS, denied any knowledge of operations targeting Patton. The army reaffirmed that Patton died of natural complications from his accident. But Bezzeta didn't recant. In 1984, he attended an OSS Veterans Reunion dinner in Washington, D.C. During the event, he stood and publicly repeated his claims about Patton's death. He told a room full of former intelligence operatives that he had been part of the operation. The room fell silent. No one challenged him. No one confirmed him. But no one laughed either. The silence was telling. Several attendees later told journalists they believed Bezzeta might be telling the truth. Others said the story was plausible, given what they knew about OSS operations during the period. Still others said Bezzeta was either lying or confused, mixing real operations with imagined ones. Douglas Bezzeta died in 1999 at age 88, maintaining his story until the end. To this day, no evidence has emerged to definitively prove or disprove his claims. But the fact that a legitimate OSS operative with a documented service record made such specific allegations has kept the conspiracy theory alive. Chapter 6. The Missing Evidence and the Cold War Context. If there was a conspiracy to assassinate General Patton, the evidence should exist somewhere. Intelligence agencies, even when conducting illegal operations, maintain records, operational plans, mission reports, personnel assignments, financial records, after-action reviews. These documents might be classified, compartmentalized, hidden in archives so secure that most government officials don't know they exist. But they exist. So researchers have been searching for decades. What they've found is a pattern of systematic absence. Every document that might confirm or disprove the assassination theory is either missing, destroyed, or classified beyond reach. Patton's medical records, missing. The accident investigation report, classified, then lost. OSS operational files from December 1945, heavily redacted. Personnel records for the truck driver, non-existent. Communications between the War Department and Patton's command, incomplete. Hospital visitor logs from Heidelberg, destroyed. Even routine documents that should exist, that have no national security implications, that would normally be preserved in military archives, are gone. This creates an evidentiary void. Conspiracy theorists point to the missing documents as proof of a cover-up. If there was nothing to hide, they argue, why are so many records missing? Skeptics argue that missing records prove nothing. Documents from 1945 are often incomplete. Archives have limited space. Files are destroyed per retention schedules. Sometimes things just get lost. Both arguments have merit, but the context matters. The Cold War was beginning in December 1945. The Office of Strategic Services was transitioning to the Central Intelligence Agency. American intelligence operations were becoming more sophisticated, more compartmentalized, more willing to conduct operations that violated both law and ethics in service of national security. We know this now because documents from that era have been declassified, slowly, over decades. We know about Operation Paperclip, which brought Nazi scientists to America despite their war crimes. We know about MK-Ultra, which conducted mind control experiments on unwitting American citizens. We know about COINTELPRO, which surveilled and disrupted domestic political groups. We know about assassination programs targeting foreign leaders like Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba. We know American intelligence agencies were capable of murder, deception, and massive cover-ups. So when someone suggests they might have killed an inconvenient general in 1945, it's not a crazy theory. It's consistent with what we know those agencies did. The question isn't whether American intelligence agencies were capable of such an operation. The question is whether they actually conducted one. And without the evidence, we cannot know for certain. Epilogue. What if Patton had lived? The final question haunts every discussion of Patton's death. What if he had survived? What if the accident had been less severe? What if he had recovered? What if he had returned to the United States? Would George Patton have become a political figure? Would he have run for office, bringing his celebrity status and military reputation into the political arena? Would he have testified before Congress about Soviet violations of the Yalta agreements, about forced population transfers, about political purges in Eastern Europe? Would he have written a book exposing what he viewed as Allied betrayals of the peoples we claim to liberate? Would he have shaped public opinion about the emerging Cold War? We'll never know. But the fact that we ask these questions reveals something important. Patton mattered. His voice mattered. His perspective, right or wrong, represented a viewpoint that vanished from American discourse after December 1945. Some historians argue that Patton's death was fortunate for America. His aggressive stance toward the Soviet Union could have triggered a premature confrontation that would have been catastrophic. The Cold War required careful management, patient containment, strategic diplomacy. Patton would have undermined all of that. Other historians argue that Patton was right, that confronting Soviet expansion immediately, while American forces were still mobilized in Europe, would have prevented decades of Cold War conflict, that his warnings about Stalin were prescient and should have been heeded. Both arguments assume Patton would have had significant influence if he had lived, and maybe that's why he died. The last line Patton wrote in his diary, just days before the accident, reads, "History will prove me right. They just don't want to hear it yet." He never got the chance to make his case. 79 years later, the debate continues. Was his death a tragic accident? A politically convenient outcome that some officials were relieved to see? Or a calculated assassination ordered by intelligence agencies that viewed him as a threat to national security? The files remain classified. The witnesses remain silent. The medical records remain missing. And George Smith Patton Jr. remains buried in Luxembourg, alongside the soldiers he commanded, his warnings unheeded, his voice silenced, his truth lost to history. Unless Douglas Bazata was telling the truth, unless somewhere, in some classified archive, the evidence exists, unless someday someone finds the files that prove what really happened on that December morning in 1945. Until then, we're left with questions, and sometimes the questions we cannot answer reveal more than the questions we can. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most forbidden mysteries, hit that hype button and let the algorithm know this is the kind of content you want to see more of. And if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're wide awake at noon or drifting off at 3 a.m. halfway across the globe. Your comments make this community what it is. And a massive thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this topic. This one's going to take us somewhere we've never been before. Now, let's talk about the Anunnaki. The discovery. Every civilization tells the same story. Gods came from the sky, created mankind, and vanished. In the spring of 2024, an archaeologist named Daniel Reeves found something buried beneath that story, and it nearly destroyed him. Picture this: a research dig outside Eridu, Iraq, the world's first recorded city. The desert stretches endlessly in all directions, broken only by ancient mounds that hide the foundations of humanity's earliest experiments with civilization. The heat's oppressive, the kind that makes you question every decision that led you to this moment. Dust devils spin across the landscape, and the horizon shimmers with mirages that look like water but promise only more sand. Reeves was part of a small, privately funded team excavating a Sumerian temple foundation. The funding came from a tech entrepreneur fascinated by ancient history, the kind of money that let them work without the usual constraints of academic bureaucracy or government oversight. Just 6 people, Reeves as lead archaeologist, 2 graduate students named Tom Chen and Lisa Okafor, a site surveyor named James Whitmore, a translator named Amira Hassan, who specialised in ancient Sumerian, and a documentary filmmaker named Kevin Park, who was supposed to be capturing the dig for a future series about archaeological discoveries. The work was methodical, painstaking, the kind of thing that usually yields pottery shards and temple receipts, the mundane paperwork of ancient bureaucracy. They'd been at it for 6 weeks, mapping the temple foundation, cataloguing fragments of clay tablets, photographing everything in meticulous detail. Standard archaeology, the kind that builds careers slowly and carefully. But on a Tuesday morning in late March, everything changed. They were excavating what should have been a storage room on the eastern side of the temple complex. Lisa was working with a brush and small hand tools, carefully removing sediment that had accumulated over 45 centuries. She hit something solid, heard the scrape of metal on stone. Not unusual, plenty of stones in ancient foundations. But this stone was different. It was too smooth, too regular. She called Reeves over. He knelt beside her, examined the surface she had exposed. It was limestone, but worked with a precision that seemed unusual for the period. The surface had been ground flat, polished to a mirror smoothness that would have required significant effort and sophisticated technique. And there were marks on it, shallow grooves that might have been decorative or might have been something else. "Keep going," Reeves said. "Let's see what we have." 3 hours later, they'd exposed a stone slab nearly 2 meters on each side, set flush into the floor. The grooves formed a pattern, geometric and deliberate, spiralling from the edges toward the center where a circular depression suggested some kind of mechanism or seal. Amira examined the grooves carefully, running her fingers along them, feeling the depth and spacing. "These aren't decorative," she said. "They're inscriptions, but I don't recognize the script. It's older than standard cuneiform, more pictographic. Proto-writing maybe, or something else entirely." Tom set up the ground-penetrating radar while Lisa and Kevin documented everything with photographs and video. The GPR results came back showing a void beneath the stone slab, a chamber roughly 4 meters deep and extending 6 meters in each direction. "We need to open it," Reeves said. Nobody argued. They worked for 2 days, carefully prying up the stone slab with jacks and leverage, afraid of damaging whatever was beneath. When it finally lifted free, the smell hit them first. Not decay or rot, but something else. something metallic and sharp that made their eyes water. The air from the chamber below was different, processed through stone for millennia, sealed away from the world above. James rigged lighting and lowered it into the chamber. The lights came on, and everyone gathered around the opening to look. The chamber was lined with stone blocks, each carved with inscriptions that covered every surface. The writing was dense, layered, some characters carved over others as if someone had run out of space and kept adding more information. But that wasn't what made them all stop and stare in silence. On the far wall, illuminated by their temporary lights, was a massive carving nearly 2 meters tall. 2 figures, humanoid, but not quite human. Their proportions were wrong, legs too long, arms too angular, heads slightly too large. They wore fitted garments that looked more like flight suits than ancient robes, covered in geometric patterns that might have been decorative or might have been functional. And they were holding tablets, not clay tablets. These tablets glowed in the carving, represented with a luminescence that had been achieved by inlaying the stone with some kind of crystalline material that caught the light and scattered it. The tablets were covered in grid patterns, regular arrangements of squares that looked less like writing and more like circuit boards, like technology rendered in stone by people who shouldn't have had any concept of such things. "Get down there," Reeves told Tom and Kevin. "Document everything. Every angle, every inscription, everything." They spent the next 3 days in that chamber. The inscriptions covered not just the walls but the floor and ceiling, a complete enclosure of information. Amira worked herself to exhaustion trying to translate, filling notebooks with sketches and notes, consulting references on her laptop, comparing characters to known Sumerian texts. The dating came back from samples they'd carefully extracted. 4,500 years before the Common Era, give or take a century. That would make it contemporary with the very founding of Sumerian civilization, possibly even earlier. Contemporary with the moment when humans supposedly first figured out writing and agriculture and organised religion. But the inscriptions didn't read like early writing. They read like something mature, developed, technical. Then came the pigment analysis. The crystalline material inlaid in the carved tablets contained trace amounts of iridium, a metal rarely found on Earth's surface. Iridium comes from space, from meteor impacts, or from deep in the planet's core where it sank billions of years ago when the Earth was molten. You don't find it in surface deposits. You don't mine it with ancient technology. You don't accidentally incorporate it into artwork, unless someone brought it from somewhere else. Reeves documented everything methodically. He took hundreds of photographs from every angle, collected samples of the stone and the inlay material, filled 3 hard drives with video footage and data files. His field notes, later leaked through a series of encrypted emails to contacts at the British Museum, contained observations that read less like archaeology and more like science fiction. One entry, dated March 28th, 2024. The inscriptions refer to the design of life, not as a gift, but as a project. They mention something called the model of the clay, which reads like an instruction manual for genetic creation. The figures aren't gods receiving worship. They're scientists documenting an experiment. Another entry, March 30th. Translation of Chamber Wall, Section 4. The pattern was set into the clay, ratio 7:3, aligned with the breath sequence. 23 pairs achieved stability. The creation walked and spoke and remembered instruction. This isn't poetry. It's a procedure. 23 pairs. The human genome contains 23 pairs of chromosomes. Nobody in 4500 BCE should have known that. Nobody should have even understood what chromosomes were, let alone how to count them. The breath sequence. DNA requires specific base pair sequences to function, patterns that repeat in rhythms, instructions written in chemical notation that wouldn't be discovered for another 5,000 years. The creation walked and spoke and remembered. higher cognitive function, language capability, memory formation, the defining characteristics of human consciousness, described in clinical terms by people who shouldn't have had the framework to think in those terms. Kevin captured all of it on video. Hours of footage, wide shots and close-ups, Amira translating in real time, Reeves examining the inscriptions with increasingly frantic energy as he realised what they might be looking at. That was the last official transmission from the dig site. On April 2nd, 2024, Reeves uploaded his field notes to an encrypted cloud server and sent copies to 3 colleagues he trusted. On April 3rd, he tried to contact the British Museum to arrange a consultation with their Sumerian experts. On April 4th, the dig site was shut down. After that, just static. Act 1. The official story. To understand what happened next, we need to understand what the Anunnaki actually are, at least according to the accepted historical record. The Anunnaki appear throughout Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian mythology as the pantheon of major gods who shape the world and humanity's place in it. The word itself breaks down in Sumerian. Anu, referring to the sky or heaven, and Kai, meaning earth, with the connecting Na, suggesting descent or origin. They are literally those who from heaven to earth came. There's Anu, the Sky Father, the ultimate authority among the gods, remote and powerful, sitting in judgment over both divine and human affairs. There's Enki, god of wisdom, water and creation, portrayed as the craftsman who shaped humanity, who gave us intelligence and knowledge, who often intervened on behalf of his creations against harsher gods. And there's Enlil, god of air and command, who saw humans as a necessary workforce but little more, who advocated for humanity's destruction when we became too numerous and noisy. These aren't obscure figures mentioned in a single text. Thousands of clay tablets recovered from sites across ancient Mesopotamia mention them, describe their actions, catalogue their relationships and conflicts. The Epic of Gilgamesh references them. The Atrahasis epic describes them in detail. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, places them at the centre of cosmic order. Museums around the world house these artefacts. The British Museum, the Louvre, the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology, the National Museum of Iraq. Translations exist, peer-reviewed and documented by Assyriologists who've spent entire careers studying these texts. This is established historical fact, at least as much as anything from 5,000 years ago can be called fact. The standard interpretation treats them as mythology, as primitive humans attempt to explain the world through storytelling and supernatural agency. Ancient people didn't understand natural phenomena, didn't know about weather patterns or geological processes or biological evolution, so they invented gods to explain what they saw. The Anunnaki were powerful beings who controlled things humans couldn't control, who provided order and meaning to an otherwise chaotic existence. Standard mythology, right? The kind of creation story every ancient culture has. Gods make humans, humans worship gods, everyone knows their place. The Sumerians weren't special in this regard. Every civilization from the Greeks to the Maya to the Norse had pantheons of powerful beings who created the world and shaped human destiny. Except the Sumerian texts are remarkably specific about certain details. They describe the Anunnaki coming to Earth with specific purposes, mining operations in southern Africa according to some texts, agricultural development in Mesopotamia according to others. They needed workers for their projects, labour that could perform complex tasks but remain under control, so they created humans. The Sumerian term is Adamu, the first man, created to serve, but the creation process is described with unusual precision. Enki, the god of wisdom and creation, took the clay of the earth and mixed it with the essence of the gods, combining earthly matter with divine substance in specific ratios to create something new. One text describes it this way: "In the clay, God and man shall be bound, to a unity brought together, so that to the end of days the flesh and the soul, which in a god have ripened, that soul in a blood kinship be bound. Clay and blood, earth and essence, physical matter and genetic information, instructions for creating life by combining existing biological material with new patterns, new code. And here's where Daniel Reeves's field notes started to sound less like fanciful interpretation and more like genuine alarm, because the inscriptions in that sealed chamber described the same process, but in language that read less like mythology and more like technical documentation. One section, laboriously translated by Amira Hassan over 3 exhausting days, the clay was refined through 7 passes, removing impurities, establishing baseline compatibility. The essence was introduced in measured proportion, 7 parts clay to 3 parts essence. The ratio determined through prior testing on lesser forms. 23 binding pairs were established, each pair encoding specific function, structure, cognition, reproduction, lifespan regulation, sensory input processing, motor control, metabolic efficiency. 7:3 ratio, 23 pairs, specific functions encoded in binding pairs. This wasn't poetry, this wasn't metaphor, this was a procedure, written by someone who understood genetics at a level that shouldn't have been possible for people working in 4500 BCE. Another section described outcomes. Initial trials produced unstable forms, insufficient cognitive capability, shortened lifespan, inadequate reproductive compatibility. Adjustments were made to binding sequences, enhanced neural pathways, extended telomere structures, improved protein synthesis efficiency. Final form achieved stability after 47 iterations. 47 iterations. Trial and error. Scientific method. Someone was refining a process, learning from failures, improving results through systematic experimentation. The standard interpretation of Anunnaki mythology involves gods moulding humans from clay, like a sculptor working with raw material. But Reeves had found something that suggested those ancient myths were preserving memory of something real, something that actually happened. Not spiritual creation, but biological engineering. Not divine magic, but applied science by beings who understood genetics and molecular biology in ways that humans wouldn't rediscover for thousands of years, and someone noticed that he'd found it. Aced 2. The cover-up. Within 72 hours of Reeves's last field note upload, the excavation was shut down. The sequence of events moved with the kind of efficiency that suggested someone had been monitoring the dig closely and was ready to act the moment something specific was discovered. April 4th, 9:30 in the morning local time. 2 vehicles arrived at the dig site, one from the Iraqi Department of Antiquities, one from a private American contractor called Archon Solutions. 6 men total, carrying documents and wearing professional business clothes completely inappropriate for the desert heat. The man from the Department of Antiquities, whose name was listed as Hakim Rashid in the documents, but whose actual identity remained unclear, informed Reeves that the excavation was being shut down immediately. The stated reasons: site contamination from improper handling of artifacts, excavation beyond permitted boundaries, failure to properly document chain of custody for samples removed from the site, and concerns about damage to culturally significant materials. Reeves tried to argue. He showed them the documentation, the photographs, the meticulous records they'd kept. He explained that they'd followed every protocol, exceeded every standard for archaeological preservation, done everything by the book and then some. Rashid was unmoved. The decision had been made at higher levels, he explained. There was nothing he could do. The site would be sealed pending further investigation. The men from Archon Solutions said nothing. They just stood there in their business, casual clothes and reflective sunglasses, watching, waiting for the conversation to end so they could begin their work. "What's Archon's involvement?" Reeves asked. "This is an archaeological site under Iraqi jurisdiction. Why is a private American contractor here?" Rashid's face tightened slightly. Archon has a contract with the Ministry to provide technical assessment and remediation services for sites that may present environmental or safety concerns. Their involvement is routine and appropriate. It wasn't routine, it wasn't appropriate. American contractors don't show up within hours of a discovery unless they were already close, already watching, already prepared to intervene. Within 6 hours, Archon had cordoned off the entire excavation area with security fencing and warning signs. They brought in equipment, sophisticated gear that looked more like military tech than archaeological tools, ground-penetrating radar arrays, electromagnetic scanning equipment, atmospheric sampling devices, all set up with practiced efficiency by technicians who clearly did this regularly. The team wasn't allowed back to the site. They watched from a distance as the chamber they'd discovered was accessed by Archon personnel, wearing full environmental suits, the kind you'd use for hazardous materials or biological containment. Everything they'd found, samples, hard drives, notebooks, equipment, was confiscated as evidence in the ongoing investigation. Reeves managed to keep his laptop and one backup drive that he'd hidden in his tent. Everything else was gone. By April 7th, the entire team was in Baghdad being processed for departure. Their visas were suddenly found to have administrative irregularities. Their permits were under review pending investigation into the violations at the site. They needed to return to their countries of origin immediately and await further instructions. Tom Chen, Lisa Okafor and James Whitmore took the hint. They flew home, understanding that arguing would only make things worse for their careers. Kevin Park went back to South Korea, his footage and equipment confiscated, his documentary dead before it started. Amira Hassan, being Iraqi, stayed in Baghdad but was told in no uncertain terms that discussing the excavation publicly would result in consequences for both her and her family. She went quiet. Only Daniel Reeves refused to let it go. Back in London, he tried to make sense of what had happened. He had his backup drive with copies of most of the photographs and his field notes, enough to remember what they'd found, even if he couldn't prove it anymore. He reached out to colleagues, tried to piece together who had the power to shut down an excavation that quickly and thoroughly. Most people told him to let it go. He'd screwed up the politics somehow, probably by not properly coordinating with Iraqi authorities before going too deep. Or maybe the funding source was problematic. Maybe the tech entrepreneur who'd backed them had enemies who wanted to cause trouble. Or maybe, most likely, he'd simply gotten unlucky and stumbled into some bureaucratic turf war between Iraqi agencies. Just drop it, they said. Take the loss, learn from it, move on to the next project. Academia was full of dead ends and political complications. This wasn't unusual. This was just how things went sometimes. But one person listened. Rachel Monroe was an investigative journalist who specialised in the shadowy spaces where government secrecy, military operations and private contractors overlapped. She'd covered the looting of the Iraqi National Museum after the 2003 invasion, had traced stolen artefacts through black markets from Baghdad to London to New York. She'd exposed private military companies running protection rackets at archaeological sites, documented the systematic destruction of cultural heritage under the cover of conflict. When Reeves contacted her through an encrypted messaging app, she was sceptical. Another archaeologist angry about losing funding, probably. Another academic with a conspiracy theory about governments hiding history. She'd heard it all before, the stories about suppressed evidence and secret knowledge. Almost always nonsense. Then Reeves showed her the iridium analysis. He showed her the photographs of inscriptions that described genetics in a way that shouldn't have been possible in 4500 BCE. He showed her the carbon dating results, and the pigment composition reports, and the translation notes that read like laboratory procedures. Monroe's skepticism turned into curiosity. She started asking questions, making calls, digging through databases and public records, looking for information about Archon Geosolutions. What she found was a maze of shell companies and classification barriers, but the outline was clear enough to be troubling. Archon Geosolutions was, on paper, a geological surveying and environmental consulting firm based in McLean, Virginia. They had contracts throughout the Middle East, concentrated heavily in Iraq, doing site assessments for construction projects and infrastructure development. Their website showed smiling engineers in hard hats, satellite imagery of terrain analysis, corporate language about safety and efficiency and cutting-edge technology. Standard corporate work, nothing suspicious on the surface. But Monroe had her sources in the intelligence community, people who leaked when they felt the public deserved to know what was happening in their name. She started asking about Archon specifically, about their work in Iraq, about what they were really doing under the cover of geological surveys. One source, a former contractor who'd worked in Baghdad and gotten disillusioned with the whole operation, gave her enough to start tracing the money. Archon's primary funding didn't come from construction companies or infrastructure projects. It came through a series of shell companies that eventually led back to a bioinformatics research group with ties to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the Pentagon's Science and Technology Development Arm. The research group had been active in Baghdad since 2003, right after the invasion, operating under various cover identities and corporate fronts. Their stated research focus, in the few classified documents Monroe could access through her sources, comparative genomics and non-terrestrial isotopic DNA studies. Non-terrestrial, as in not from Earth. Monroe obtained leaked satellite imagery of the Eridu site, taken before and after the shutdown. Before the shutdown, the excavation showed a typical dig pattern, organised grid squares, careful systematic exposure of the archaeological layers, standard academic work. After the shutdown, thermal imaging revealed extensive underground scanning operations. The equipment signatures matched deep penetration ground mapping systems, the kind used to map subterranean structures without excavation, to find caves and tunnels and voids deep below the surface. Archon wasn't covering up the site. They were exploring it further, going deeper, looking for something else, and they didn't want witnesses. Monroe got one more piece of the puzzle through a source at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Archon had requested and received updated satellite coverage of a specific area around Eridu, continuous monitoring that went far beyond what a simple geological survey would require. The coverage extended for kilometres in all directions, high-resolution thermal and electromagnetic spectrum analysis, updated every 6 hours. They were looking for something specific, some kind of signature or anomaly that required constant monitoring. And whatever it was important enough to justify shutting down an archaeological dig and classifying everything Reeves had found. Someone wasn't trying to hide the past, Monroe said when she and Reeves met in a quiet London pub to compare notes. They were trying to reclaim it. Whatever the Anunnaki left behind, whoever they actually were, someone thinks it's valuable enough to bury under classification and corporate fronts. Reeves looked at the documents spread across the table between them, the shell company connections and satellite imagery and leaked memos. So what do we do? Monroe smiled, the kind of smile that meant she'd already decided to do something dangerous. We find out what else they've found. If Eridu was shut down this quickly, there must be other sites, other discoveries that got buried, a pattern we can trace. She pulled out a map of the Middle East, marked with archaeological sites from Syria to Iran. Let's see where else the gods came from the sky. Act 3. The Pattern. Reeves and Monroe spent the next 6 weeks building a database of archaeological discoveries in the Middle East that had been shut down, classified, or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The pattern emerged quickly once they knew what to look for. In 1994, a joint Turkish-German team excavating near the ancient city of Harran in southern Turkey uncovered a series of stone tablets with inscriptions that predated known Sumerian writing. The tablets described a gathering place, a garden where the gods instructed the first humans in agriculture, law, and proper worship. The texts were remarkably detailed. describing irrigation techniques that wouldn't be developed until centuries later, astronomical observations that required sophisticated mathematics, medical procedures that suggested anatomical knowledge beyond what primitive cultures should have possessed. The excavation was shut down within 3 weeks. Officially, the closure was due to funding issues and concerns about political instability in the region, since Harran sat near the Syrian border in an area with a history of ethnic tensions. The tablets were transferred to Turkish government archives in Ankara for preservation and further study, but they never appeared in any published research, no peer-reviewed papers, no museum exhibitions. The Turkish government claimed the tablets were too fragile for display, too poorly preserved for reliable translation. A few photographs existed in preliminary reports, but the tablets themselves vanished into climate-controlled storage and were never seen again. Monroe traced the excavation permits and found something interesting. The dig had been partially funded by a grant from an educational foundation based in Switzerland, an organisation that claimed to support international archaeological research and cultural preservation. That foundation received its funding from a consortium of private donors whose identities were protected by Swiss privacy laws. But one of those donors had been careless with their paperwork. A tax filing from 1996 showed a charitable donation to the foundation from a holding company that eventually traced back to the same network that funded Archangeo Solutions. Someone had been paying attention to Harran. Someone had been close enough to shut it down when the tablets were discovered. The Syrian site came next in their research. In 2001, a French archaeological mission working near Tel Brak in northern Syria discovered a chamber beneath an ancient temple, similar to what Reeves had found at Eridu. The chamber contained carved images of figures descending from the sky in vehicles that were described in the field notes as brilliance that moves, craft that shone like stars and moved with purpose rather than drifting like celestial objects. The carvings showed these vehicles opening, figures emerging who were clearly not human despite their generally humanoid shape. The proportions were wrong, the features subtly off, the way they stood and moved captured in stone in ways that suggested the carvers were working from observation rather than imagination. Local Syrian authorities seized the findings within days, citing concerns about looting and the need to protect culturally significant materials. The chamber was resealed, the site was declared off limits, and the French team was expelled from the country under accusations of attempting to smuggle artefacts. No peer-reviewed paper was ever published. The French team members who worked on the dig had to sign non-disclosure agreements with their own government before they could leave Syria, a highly unusual requirement that suggested pressure from higher levels than just academic archaeology. Monroe found one of those team members, a retired archaeologist named Claude Mercier living in a small village in Brittany. He was willing to talk carefully about what they'd actually found. The vehicles were rendered with technical precision, Mercier explained in French, which Monroe translated as they spoke. Not mythological or symbolic. These were craft with specific features, landing mechanisms, what looked like propulsion systems, and the figures emerging from them were carrying containers, equipment, tools. They weren't gods receiving worship. They were a team arriving to do a job. What kind of job? Monroe asked. Mercier shrugged. The inscriptions around the image described the beginning of instruction. The gods, or whatever they were, teaching humans about agriculture, about building, about organising society. But the language was strange, very clinical. Not the gods blessed humanity with knowledge, but the subjects were educated in necessary procedures. Like a mission report, you understand? Like colonisers documenting their process. Did you take photographs? Of course. Hours of documentation, all confiscated when we were expelled. Mercier paused, looked around his small living room as if checking for listeners, then continued more quietly. But I kept some notes, personal observations that weren't in the official documentation. I can show you those, if you promise to be careful with what you do with them. The notes described in detail what Mercier had seen, observations that hadn't made it into the confiscated official reports. The figures in the carvings wore fitted garments with what looked like functional features, pockets or pouches or equipment attachment points. Their heads were covered with something that looked like protective gear, angular and smooth, with areas that might have been viewing ports or sensors. These weren't gods, Mercier's notes read. These were technicians, specialists, people in equipment designed for a specific environment. Everything about them suggested function over form, purpose over decoration. And the vehicles were even more interesting, with what looked like attitude control thrusters, landing struts, modular components. Whoever carved these images knew what they were looking at because they'd seen it. The Iranian site completed the pattern Munro and Reeves were building. In 2008, an Iranian team working near Susa, the ancient capital of Elam in southwestern Iran, found clay cylinders sealed in a foundation deposit beneath the temple complex. The cylinders contained cuneiform text that, when translated, described the Anunnaki not as spiritual beings, but as physical entities who came from a place beyond the sky, whose home was a wandering star that brought them close to Earth in cycles measured in thousands of years. The text described their arrival as a necessity, not a choice. Their home world was dying, or moving away, or becoming uninhabitable. Earth was identified as suitable for their purposes, rich in resources they needed, compatible enough with their biology to allow colonization with appropriate precautions, and humanity. Humanity was described as a solution to a labour shortage. The Anunnaki needed workers for their projects, mining operations or construction or agriculture, tasks that required intelligence and dexterity but not full consciousness or equality. So they created humans by modifying existing primates native to Earth, uplifting them through genetic manipulation to serve specific purposes. The Iranian government classified the findings immediately, invoking cultural heritage protection laws that made the cylinders state secrets. No translation was published. No photographs were released. The team members were told their work had national security implications and that discussing it publicly would result in serious consequences. But one team member, a linguist specialising in ancient Elamite and Akkadian, had fled Iran 3 years later during the political turmoil of the Green Movement. Now, living in Germany under a different name, she was willing to talk to Munro about what she'd translated, though she wouldn't allow her identity to be revealed. The cylinders were very specific about timescales, she explained in careful English. They described the arrival as happening 43 cycles ago, each cycle being the time it took for their homeworld to complete one orbit and return to the inner region where Earth was located. They calculated each cycle as approximately 3,600 Earth years. 43 cycles at 3,600 years each. That's approximately 155,000 years ago. Right around the time modern humans began exhibiting behavioural modernity, when Homo sapiens suddenly started creating art, using symbolic communication, developing complex tools and social structures. The evolutionary leap that anthropologists call the Great Leap Forward, when anatomically modern humans who'd existed for 200,000 years suddenly started acting human, suddenly developed the cognitive capabilities that would lead to civilization. Munro and Reeves looked at the map they'd been building, marked with excavation sites across ancient Mesopotamia, Syria and Turkey. Every site with a suppressed discovery, every location where unusual findings had been classified or confiscated, fell along a specific geographic arc. The arc matched the old Persian descriptions of a place called Din, a land of rivers and fertile plains where the gods first created their garden and began their work with humanity. The Hebrews later adopted the story, translating Din into Eden, the garden at the beginning of the world where God created the first humans. It's not mythology, Reeves said, staring at the map. It's a preserved memory of something that actually happened. The locations are real. The timeline is consistent, multiple independent. Cultures separated by thousands of years, all describing the same events in the same region. Munro nodded slowly. If the Anunnaki were real, if they actually came to Earth, and genetically engineered humans, then every site along this arc might contain evidence of their work, and someone has been systematically finding that evidence and classifying it for at least 30 years, probably longer. We need to see one of these sites ourselves, Reeves said. We need first-hand evidence that isn't filtered through confiscated reports and leaked documents. Monroe looked at him carefully. That's dangerous. If someone is actively suppressing this information, if governments and private contractors are coordinating to keep it secret, then investigating too openly makes us targets. I know. Reeves pointed to a location on the map in southern Turkey, but I'm already too deep to stop now. And there's one site we can access without permits or official channels, a place that's already been excavated and studied, where we can look for the same patterns without alerting anyone. Göbekli Tepe, Monroe said. Göbekli Tepe, Reeves confirmed. AC-4, the connection. They flew into Gaziantep, Turkey, in late May of 2024, travelling separately to avoid attention. Monroe used her journalist credentials to arrange interviews with local tourism officials, establishing a cover story about writing an article on archaeological tourism in southeastern Turkey. Reeves came as a tourist, just another visitor interested in ancient history. Göbekli Tepe is extraordinary even by mainstream archaeological standards. It's a massive stone temple complex dating back nearly 12,000 years, built by people who supposedly hadn't invented agriculture yet, hadn't developed writing, hadn't created permanent settlements or centralised authority. Yet somehow, these primitive hunter-gatherers organised the labour and expertise to quarry, carve, transport and erect stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, arranged in perfect circles with astronomical alignments and sophisticated artistic imagery. The site rewrites everything archaeologists thought they knew about the development of human civilization. The standard narrative says agriculture comes first, then permanent settlements, then social complexity, then monumental architecture, then religion and art. Göbekli Tepe reverses that sequence completely. It suggests that religion and communal gathering came first, that the desire to build sacred spaces drove human development rather than practical concerns like food production and shelter. It's a reasonable theory, supported by evidence, accepted by mainstream archaeology as a revolutionary but legitimate discovery. But Reeves and Monroe weren't interested in the official narrative. They were looking for something else, for patterns that might connect Göbekli Tepe to the other suppressed sites they'd researched. They spent 3 days at the site, photographing everything, taking measurements, examining the carvings on the massive T-shaped pillars. The artistic imagery was sophisticated, depicting animals with anatomical accuracy that suggested close observation, geometric patterns that implied mathematical understanding, and strange symbols that might have been early writing or might have been something else entirely. On the 4th day, they met with Aydin Yilmaz, a retired geologist who had done core sampling work at Göbekli Tepe in the early 2000s. He'd agreed to meet them at a small cafe in Şanlıurfa, near a city, after Monroe contacted him through academic channels and mentioned that they were investigating unusual findings at ancient sites. Yilmaz was in his early 70s, lean and weathered, with the careful manner of someone who'd spent decades working with data that didn't fit comfortable explanations. He ordered tea for all of them, then got straight to the point. "You're asking about the metal traces," he said in English with a thick accent. "The anomalies I found in the core samples." "Yes," Monroe said. "We've seen similar patterns at other sites. Iridium traces, unusual isotopic ratios, material that doesn't match natural geological processes." Yilmaz nodded slowly. "I've kept my samples and data. Never published because the patterns didn't make sense, and I didn't want to risk my reputation on speculation without more evidence. But I've wondered for 20 years what those traces meant, where they came from." He had brought a box of materials with him, core samples stored in plastic tubes with handwritten labels, printouts of spectroscopic analysis from various labs, notebooks filled with calculations and observations. He spread it all on the table between them like evidence at a trial. Every core sample taken from the temple area shows metallic micro-residues, Yilmaz explained. The concentrations are small, parts per million, but they're consistently present throughout the site. The metallic signature is similar to what you'd find at meteor impact sites, high iridium content mixed with platinum group metals. But, Reeves prompted, but the isotopic ratios are wrong. Yilmaz pulled out a specific printout, pointed to columns of numbers. Natural meteors have characteristic isotopic signatures, specific ratios of different elements that match what we find in asteroid belt samples and other space debris. These samples don't match. The ratios are off by enough that it can't be explained by natural variation or contamination. Meaning? Monroe asked, though she already suspected the answer. Meaning this is manufactured alloy, not natural meteor material. Someone processed these metals deliberately, mixed them in specific proportions, created a material with properties that serve some purpose, and then someone used that material at this site 12,000 years ago. The implications hung in the air between them. Göbekli Tepe was already difficult to explain with conventional theories. Hunter-gatherers building massive stone temples was strange enough, but hunter-gatherers using manufactured extraterrestrial alloys? That pushed the boundaries of credible explanation into territory most archaeologists wouldn't touch. How widely distributed are the traces, Reeves asked. Are they concentrated in specific areas, or spread throughout the site? Yilmaz consulted his notebooks. Most concentrated around the central pillars in each circle, particularly at the base where the pillars were set into the bedrock. Also present in the soil layers associated with the construction period, less so in earlier or later layers. So whatever this material was, it was being used during the building phase, Monroe said. Maybe as some kind of tool or equipment that left residue. Or maybe, Reeves said quietly, it was incorporated intentionally, some kind of marker or signature, something that would identify this location as important to whoever put it there. Yilmaz looked between them carefully. You're suggesting something beyond conventional archaeology. We're following evidence, Monroe said. Sometimes evidence leads to uncomfortable places. They spent another 2 hours going through Yilmaz's data, documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes. The metallic traces were undeniably present. The isotopic analysis was rigorous and properly conducted, and the conclusion that the material was manufactured rather than natural was solidly supported by the data. As they were preparing to leave, Yilmaz added one more observation. There's something else I never understood. The astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe are very precise, tracking the positions of specific stars as they would have appeared 12,000 years ago. But there's one alignment that doesn't match any known celestial object, pointing to a region of space where nothing significant is visible. Where? Reeves asked. Yilmaz pulled out a star chart marked with calculations. The ecliptic south pole below the plane of the solar system. The pillars aligned to point towards something that would have been in that direction 12,000 years ago. Something important enough to memorialize in stone, but nothing we can identify today. Monroe and Reeves exchanged glances. The ecliptic south pole. The direction from which something might approach if it was coming from outside the solar system, or from a highly inclined orbit that took it far above or below the plane where the planets travel. That means someone brought it here, Monroe said after they'd left the cafe and were walking through Şanlıurfa's bustling streets. The Anunnaki, or whoever they actually were, they used manufactured materials. They had technology sophisticated enough to leave traces that last 12,000 years, and they built monuments aligned to point toward where they came from. Reeves was quiet for a moment, thinking through the implications. The tablets weren't offerings to gods. They were logs, records, an archive of what they did here, who they were, where they came from, and someone is finding those records and classifying them because the information is still relevant today. But relevant how? Monroe asked. What could ancient genetic engineering and extraterrestrial visitors have to do with current government and corporate interests? They didn't have an answer yet, but they were about to find one. Asked 5. Genesis 2. Back in London. In early June, Monroe continued working her intelligence sources, looking for any connection between the suppressed archaeological discoveries and current scientific research. She was looking for organisations that might have an interest in ancient genetic information, in extraterrestrial materials, in anything that connected past and present in the way she was beginning to suspect. It took 6 weeks of careful investigation, following money trails through corporate filings and grant applications, tracing personnel movements between government agencies and private research facilities, before she found the connection. Genesis 2. A classified research project launched in 2018 by a consortium that included biotech companies in the United States, United Kingdom, Germany and Japan, coordinated through government research agencies and funded by a mixture of public and private money hidden behind multiple layers of corporate structure. The project had a public face, occasionally mentioned in scientific journals and research publications. Officially, it was advanced genome editing research, building on CRISPR technology to develop treatments for genetic diseases. The papers describe sophisticated techniques for precisely modifying human DNA, correcting mutations that cause conditions like sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis, potentially addressing thousands of genetic disorders. Legitimate medical research, the kind that gets funding from major institutions and regulatory approval from ethics boards. The kind of work that wins Nobel Prizes and changes the future of medicine. But Monroe obtained leaked internal communications through a source she would never name, a whistleblower who'd been disturbed by what they'd seen inside the project and felt the public needed to know. The documents painted a very different picture of what Genesis 2 was actually doing. The project wasn't just fixing genetic defects, it was reverse engineering something ancient, using information extracted from Sumerian texts that had been translated by specialists working for ArcGeo Solutions. One internal memo, dated March of 2022, laid it out clearly. Primary objective is not disease treatment but enhancement architecture. Using template sequences derived from recovered ancient genetic codices, cross-referenced with modern human genome mapping, we're identifying optimizations present in the original design that have degraded through evolutionary drift. Current protocols focus on neural efficiency, cellular regeneration capability, and lifespan extension through telomere integrity restoration. Another document described the source material. Cuneiform texts provided by ArcGeo Division contain remarkably detailed genetic instruction protocols, describable in modern terms as gene insertion sequences with specific ratio requirements. Text designates these as patterns set in clay, with binding pairs that encode various physiological traits. Direct correlation to chromosomal pair structure suggests source material authors possess sophisticated understanding of genetics. They weren't following mythology. They were following a recipe, instructions left behind by whoever created humans in the first place, now being decoded by scientists with the technology to understand what they were looking at. One file labelled Enki Protocol Primary Implementation outlined specific gene sequences being tested. The sequences were based on ratios described in ancient texts. 7 parts existing human genome to 3 parts modified sequence, introducing changes that enhance cognitive function, improved cellular repair mechanisms, extended natural lifespan, increased disease resistance. The scientific language was dense, full of technical terminology about protein synthesis and gene expression, and cellular signaling pathways. But the core concept was clear. Someone was attempting to recreate the Anunnaki's original work, to engineer humans according to an ancient template that had been preserved in cuneiform text for 45 centuries. One document contained a section that made Monroe's hands shake as she read it. Phase 1 trials completed successfully on 23 subjects. All binding pair modifications achieved stable integration. Subjects demonstrate enhanced cognitive processing, improved pattern recognition, extended concentration capability. Physical health markers within acceptable ranges. No significant adverse effects observed. Proceeding to Phase 2 expansion to larger subject pool. 23 subjects. The same number of binding pairs mentioned in the ancient texts. The same number of chromosome pairs in the human genome. Not coincidence. A deliberate correspondence, following the original design specifications. Another memo discussed the broader implications. If template sequences prove universally applicable across human populations, potential applications extend beyond medical treatment into augmentation territory. Military applications obvious, enhance soldiers with superior cognitive and physical capabilities. Economic applications significant, optimized workforce with reduced health costs and extended productive lifespan. Social engineering potential requires careful ethical consideration, but represents revolutionary capability for shaping human future. They weren't curing diseases, they were redesigning humanity according to ancient specifications left by whoever created us in the first place. And they were doing it under the cover of medical research, hidden behind classifications and corporate privacy, without public knowledge or democratic oversight. Monroe showed the documents to Reeves in late July. They met at a small flat she'd rented in East London under a false name, both of them increasingly paranoid about surveillance, after weeks of investigating organisations with significant resources and motivation to keep secrets. Reeves read through everything twice, his face growing paler as the implications sank in. They're not just studying ancient history, they're using it. They found instruction manuals for creating humans and they're following them. The Anunnaki weren't gods, Monroe said. They were genetic engineers. They came to Earth with specific purposes, modified existing primates to create a workforce suited to their needs, documented everything in records that survived as mythology. And now we've reached the point where we can understand those records and recreate their work. But why? Reeves asked. What's the purpose? If someone has the resources to do this, why hide it? Why not announce a breakthrough in genetic medicine and accept the accolades? Because it's not medicine, Monroe said. Or not just medicine. Look at the applications they're discussing. Military enhancement, workforce optimization, social engineering. They're talking about creating a new type of human, designed for specific purposes, just like the Anunnaki created us. Which makes us the gods this time, Reeves said slowly. We're doing to ourselves what was done to us, following the same pattern, repeating the cycle. Monroe pulled up one more document, the one that had disturbed her most. A progress report from April of 2024, just weeks after Reeves's dig at Eridu had been shut down. Eridu recovery operation successful. Additional genetic codices retrieved from sealed chamber, expanding template library significantly. New sequences under analysis, with particular focus on behavioural modification protocols and reproductive compatibility specifications. Integration into Phase 3 planning underway. They'd gone back to Eridu after shutting down Reeves's excavation. They'd taken everything from the sealed chamber, all the information carved into those walls, and they were using it to advance their human redesign project. We have to expose this, Reeves said. We have to get this information public before they go too far. Monroe looked at him carefully. If we do that, we become major problems for very powerful people. Organisations with government connections and corporate resources and no interest in having their work disrupted. I know, Reeves met her eyes. But if we don't, they keep going. They keep following ancient instructions to redesign humanity without consent, without oversight, without any consideration of what it means to fundamentally alter what humans are. Monroe nodded slowly. Then we need more evidence. Something irrefutable. Something that proves not just what they're doing, but what it's based on. We need to confirm that the Anunnaki were real, that their legacy is still active, that this isn't just mythology being misinterpreted by zealous scientists. The vault, Reeves said. The sealed chamber under Eridu. If we can get back there, if we can document what's actually in that chamber before Archon processes everything, we'll have evidence that connects past to present. That's incredibly dangerous. I know, but I have a contact in Iraq, someone from the original dig who might be able to help us get access." Monroe looked at the documents spread across the table, the evidence of a project that was redesigning human nature based on ancient genetic engineering specifications. "When do we leave?" "Soon," Reeves said, "before they finish Phase 3 and whatever they're planning next." They started planning their return to Iraq. They arranged for encrypted backups of all their evidence, distributed to multiple trusted sources, with instructions to release everything if they didn't check in regularly. They prepared cover stories and travel arrangements, keeping everything compartmentalized and careful. By early September, they were ready to go. That was when everything accelerated in ways they couldn't have anticipated. Ast 6. The Earthquake. On April 10th, 2024, just 6 days after Reeves's excavation was shut down, a minor earthquake struck near Basra in southern Iraq. Magnitude 4.2 on the Richter scale, centered about 15 kilometers west of the city. It was barely noticed internationally, just another small seismic event in a geologically active region. Local news reported minor damage to buildings, some cracked roads, no casualties. Standard earthquake, nothing unusual. Iraq sits near the collision zone between the Arabian and Eurasian tectonic plates, so small quakes happen regularly. This one was slightly larger than average, but nothing catastrophic. Except something else happened during that earthquake, something that wasn't widely reported at the time but would become significant later. A subterranean facility was partially exposed about 8 kilometers from the earthquake's epicenter. Construction workers building a new industrial complex had been excavating for foundation work when the ground collapsed, revealing tunnels and chambers that had been hidden under centuries of sediment. Local engineers were called in to assess the structural damage and make sure nothing would collapse further. The industrial site was near oil infrastructure, so any ground instability was a serious concern. The engineers rappelled down into the newly opened void to map its extent and determine whether the surrounding area was safe. What they found didn't match their expectations at all. The tunnels were old, clearly ancient, carved into bedrock with precision that seemed impossible for primitive technology. But they weren't rough or irregular like natural caves. They were engineered, with smooth walls that showed tooling marks, regular dimensions that suggested deliberate design, and a layout that implied purpose rather than random formation. The engineers followed the main tunnel for about 30 meters before it opened into a larger chamber. That's where they found something that made them stop their survey and immediately contact Baghdad. In the center of the chamber sat a sphere roughly 3 meters in diameter, partially unearthed by the earthquake's disruption of the surrounding soil. It was made of a dark stone-like material, smooth and slightly reflective, covered in inscriptions similar to ancient cuneiform but more complex, more dense with information, carved in layers that suggested multiple rounds of inscription over time. And it was active. The engineers' radio equipment started malfunctioning as soon as they entered the chamber, producing static and interference that made communication difficult. Their measuring instruments showed erratic readings, electromagnetic fields that shouldn't exist around inert stone. One engineer had brought a handheld thermal camera, and when he pointed it at the sphere, it registered a clear thermal signature. Heat generation that had no apparent source. They retreated quickly and made their report. The Iraqi government responded within hours, sending specialists from multiple agencies, cordoning off the area and issuing immediate classification orders that made the discovery state secret. But some of the engineers had made recordings on their personal phones. Some of them had downloaded the instrument data before it was confiscated, and some of them were disturbed enough by what they'd found that they leaked information to friends and family, who shared it on social media, who sent it to researchers and journalists who might know what it meant. Monroe had sources monitoring Middle Eastern social media and obscure forums where leakers sometimes posted information. In late April, one of those sources flagged a series of posts from Iraqi accounts describing the discovery, including grainy cell phone videos that showed the sphere in its chamber. The The government's official statement came quickly. Natural mineral formations exposed by the earthquake, unusual geological phenomena caused by groundwater interactions, nothing of concern, the site sealed for safety reasons. Standard bureaucratic language designed to dismiss curiosity and discourage investigation. But the cell phone footage showed something else. The sphere's surface was clearly covered in intentional inscriptions, not natural formations. The electromagnetic readings were documented in photos of instrument displays, and one video, shot from just a few meters away before the engineers retreated, showed something extraordinary. The inscriptions on the sphere were glowing very faintly, a barely visible blue luminescence that pulsed in slow rhythm. The pulse was regular, occurring approximately every 2 seconds, constant and precise like a heartbeat. Monroe obtained more data through her sources, including copies of the official technical survey that had been classified but leaked by someone inside the Iraqi government. The survey was thorough and professional, conducted by competent engineers who knew their work. The electromagnetic readings were consistent and measurable, showing field strengths that varied from approximately 0.3 to 0.8 milligauss, pulsing in the same 2-second cycle visible in the glowing inscriptions. The thermal signature measured roughly 3 degrees Celsius above ambient temperature, again pulsing with the same rhythm. Most importantly, the spectroscopic analysis of the sphere's material showed it wasn't any kind of natural stone. It was a composite, layers of different materials fused together with precision that required sophisticated manufacturing. The outer layer contained high concentrations of iridium and platinum group metals in manufactured alloy ratios identical to what Yilmaz had found at Göbekli Tepe. Someone had built this thing using extraterrestrial materials, buried it kilometers underground in southern Iraq, and left it in a state where it could remain functional for thousands of years. If they built man in their image, Monroe's voice recorded in a memo she prepared in May, what if they left themselves a way to come back? What if this isn't a monument or a record? What if it's a beacon still transmitting after all this time, sending a signal to whoever put it here that Earth is still here, still occupied, still relevant? She and Reeves had added the Basra discovery to their growing database of suppressed evidence, another piece of the pattern they were constructing. The timing was suspicious, occurring just days after the Eridu excavation was shut down, in the same region, exposing technology that matched the evidence Reeves had found. And the fact that it was still active, still generating electromagnetic fields and thermal signatures after thousands of years, suggested engineering far beyond anything ancient humans should have been capable of creating. By the time Monroe and Reeves were planning their return to Iraq in early September, they'd accumulated evidence of multiple sites along the arc of ancient Mesopotamia where advanced technology had been found and classified, where genetic information had been preserved in texts that modern scientists were now decoding and using. They'd connected past to present, shown that the Anunnaki weren't mythology but preserved memory of something real, demonstrated that modern organizations with significant resources were following ancient instructions to redesign human genetics. But they still needed something that would convince skeptics, something that would break through the natural resistance to believing something so extraordinary. They needed direct evidence from the source, from the sealed chamber under Eridu where it all began. That's where they went in mid-September of 2024, using contacts and careful planning to slip past the security that Arkan had established around the site, and that's where they vanished. Act 7. The Global Link. While Monroe and Reeves were investigating suppressed archaeological sites and classified genetic research, other patterns were emerging on a global scale that seemed unrelated at first, but fit disturbingly well into the larger picture they had been assembling. In July of 2024, NASA quietly censored portions of deep space infrared data collected by the James Webb Space Telescope. The data had been made available to researchers through standard channels, then was suddenly reissued with sections marked as corrupted or containing instrumentation errors that rendered them unreliable. This wasn't entirely unusual. Space telescope data sometimes contains artifacts from cosmic ray impacts or sensor glitches, and corrections are routine. But the scope of the censoring was significant, affecting multiple observation periods focused on the outer solar system, particularly data collected while the telescope was imaging regions near Jupiter and beyond. Several astronomers who had already downloaded the original uncorrected data noticed something interesting in the sections that were later marked as corrupted. The infrared reading showed gravitational anomalies, subtle perturbations in the orbital paths of trans-Neptunian objects that suggested gravitational influence from something massive in the outer solar system. Not Neptune, not Pluto, not any of the known dwarf planets or large Kuiper belt objects. Something else, something big enough to affect multiple orbits in measurable ways. The astronomers started comparing notes in private communications, trying to determine whether the anomalies were real or actually instrumental errors. The data was ambiguous enough that reasonable people could disagree, but there was enough signal there to be intriguing. One researcher, an astrophysicist at MIT named Jennifer Kowalski, ran simulations based on the anomaly data to estimate what kind of object could produce the observed effects. Her preliminary results suggested a large planet-sized body, possibly several times Earth's mass, in a highly elliptical orbit that took it far beyond Pluto for most of its cycle, but brought it into the inner solar system periodically. The orbital parameters she calculated matched, with uncomfortable precision, predictions that had been made decades earlier by Zecharia Sitchin, a controversial author who had written extensively about ancient Sumerian texts and their descriptions of the Anunnaki. Sitchin's work had been largely dismissed by mainstream academics as pseudoscience, misinterpretations of ancient texts combined with faulty astronomy and wishful thinking. He claimed that Sumerian texts described a planet called Nibiru, massive and distant, whose highly elliptical orbit brought it close to Earth approximately every 3,600 years. When Nibiru approached, according to Sitchin's interpretation of the texts, the Anunnaki would return to Earth, checking on their creation, harvesting resources, maintaining their ancient installations. The texts supposedly described multiple return visits throughout history, corresponding to major transitions in human civilization, like the rise of Sumerian culture and the Bronze Age collapse. Mainstream science had rejected all of this. The astronomical predictions didn't match any observed objects, the textual interpretations were considered overly literal and selective, and the whole narrative was dismissed as ancient astronaut pseudoscience that distorted real archaeology and history. But now, Kowalski's analysis based on actual observational data was producing orbital parameters that closely matched Sitchin's predictions, at least in broad strokes. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to be disturbing. She posted her preliminary findings on a preprint server used by astronomers to share work before formal peer review. Within days, her paper was flagged and removed, marked as violating terms of service for promoting fringe theories without adequate scientific basis. Her NASA data access was suspended pending review of her research protocols, but several dozen researchers had already downloaded her paper and the supporting data. Some of them started their own analyses, tried to replicate her findings, looked for other evidence of gravitational anomalies in the outer solar system. The conversation spread through astronomical circles and spilled over into internet forums where amateur researchers and conspiracy theorists tracked evidence of official suppression and hidden knowledge. People started mapping Sitchin's predicted orbit against current planetary positions, calculating when a hypothetical Nibiru might be making its closest approach if it actually existed. The estimates varied depending on assumptions about orbital parameters, but most converged on a time frame in the mid to late 2020s, meaning now or very soon, meaning that if something was indeed approaching from the outer solar system, it might already be close enough to detect if anyone with access to good telescopes was looking in the right direction. Monroe had been tracking these developments through her network of sources, adding them to the overall picture she and Reeves were building. The astronomical data by itself wasn't conclusive, could easily be explained away as instrumental errors or misinterpretation of ambiguous measurements. But combined with everything else, with suppressed archaeological evidence and classified genetic research and ancient texts describing cyclic returns of the Anunnaki, it formed a pattern that was harder to dismiss. If Nibiru was real, if something massive was indeed approaching from the outer solar system, then what Monroe had asked in one of her notes became urgently relevant. What if the Anunnaki are already preparing Earth to receive them? She'd obtained one more document that tied everything together in ways that chilled her to read. A leaked memo from Archon Geo Solutions dated August of 2024, marked with classification levels that suggested it had been distributed only to senior personnel with specific clearances. The memo was brief, bureaucratic in tone, discussing project status in neutral technical language. Phase 3 genomic synchronization complete. Population markers within acceptable variance across target demographics. Template stability confirmed through 6-month monitoring of Phase 2 cohort. Neural enhancement protocols demonstrate sustained efficacy with no degradation. Cellular regeneration improvements holding stable. Awaiting return signal for Phase 4 implementation. Return signal. As if someone was expected to send a message, as if someone was coming back and would need certain preparations to have been completed before their arrival. Phase 4 was mentioned but not detailed in the memo Monroe had obtained, marked as classified above the document's security level. But the implication was clear. Genesis 2 had multiple phases planned, with each phase building toward some ultimate objective that required human populations to meet specific genetic criteria before implementation. If the Anunnaki were real, if they'd created humanity for specific purposes through genetic engineering, and if they were returning, then Phase 4 might be about ensuring their creations were ready, compatible, suitable for whatever purposes the Anunnaki had in mind, creating an interface, preparing a workforce, establishing compatibility between ancient genetic engineers and their modern redesigned product. Monroe had shared all of this with Reeves during their planning sessions before the Iraq trip, laying out the full scope of what they'd uncovered. The evidence was circumstantial, could be dismissed by skeptics as pattern matching and conspiracy thinking, but the pattern was consistent and the connections were documentable. "They're not coming back to check on us," Reeves had said after reading everything. "They're coming back to use us. We're a resource they created, a tool they left behind, and now they're making sure the tool is properly maintained and upgraded before they need it again." Which makes humanity what? Monroe had asked. Property, equipment, a biological technology they designed for specific purposes? Yes, Reeves said simply. And Genesis 2 is making sure we're functioning according to specifications, ready for whatever they have planned. That was the reality they were facing as they prepared to return to Erech, to investigate the sealed chamber under Eridu where it all began. They weren't just uncovering ancient history anymore. They were documenting an ongoing operation that spanned thousands of years, from humanity's creation to our present moment, all building towards something that might be imminent if the astronomical data was accurate. Their last communication before entering Iraq was an encrypted video sent to Marcus Webb, the independent researcher Monroe trusted as a dead man's switch. If they didn't return, he was supposed to release everything they'd found, make it public regardless of the consequences. "We've confirmed the existence of a sealed vault under Eridu," Monroe said in the video, her face serious but calm. "The coordinates match the old texts exactly. We're going in tonight with a local contact. The Anunnaki never left. They went underground." Reeves added his own thoughts. "If we're right, everything changes. Human history, human origin, the entire narrative of where we come from and why we're here. This isn't archaeology anymore. This is contact." Then darkness, movement, the video ending. That was September 21st, 2024. Neither Monroe nor Reeves has been heard from since. Act 8. The last transmission. The final piece of evidence, the most controversial and hardest to verify. emerged 6 weeks after Monroe and Reeves vanished. In late October of 2024, a video file appeared on an encrypted server known for hosting leaked classified material, a dark web location that had previously published government documents and corporate secrets. The server was shut down within hours of the video appearing, taken offline through coordinated action by multiple governments, but not before several researchers managed to download the file and distribute copies through other channels. The video is grainy handheld footage, clearly shot on a consumer camera or phone in challenging conditions with minimal lighting. The timestamp in the corner is corrupted, showing random characters instead of actual date and time, but forensic analysis of the visual artifacts and compression patterns suggests it was recorded in late September of 2024, consistent with when Monroe and Reeves disappeared. The video begins with darkness and the sound of heavy breathing, footsteps on stone. Then dim light appears, provided by small LED flashlights that create harsh shadows and limited visibility. The camera pans across walls of carved stone, underground, clearly ancient. But these walls aren't ordinary archaeological remains. They're covered in inscriptions that glow faintly with blue luminescence, not from external illumination, but from within the carvings themselves, as if the stone had been treated with some kind of luminescent material, or as if the inscriptions themselves were generating light through some unknown process. The glow pulses slowly, rhythmically, getting slightly brighter and dimmer in cycles that last about 2 seconds each. The pattern is identical across all the walls, synchronized as if controlled by some central mechanism. Rachel Monroe's voice, recognizable from other recordings, though the audio quality is poor. This isn't a tomb, it's not a temple or a storage vault, it's a system, a machine that's been asleep for thousands of years. The camera continues panning, and the inscriptions pulse brighter as the lens passes over them. The patterns are extraordinarily complex, layered information encoded in visual form, some characters recognizable as variations on Sumerian cuneiform, but others completely unknown, geometric and precise in ways that suggest mathematical or technical notation rather than linguistic meaning. "It's reacting to us," Reeves's voice says from behind the camera, tense with excitement or fear or both. "Our presence, our bioelectric fields, something. It's waking up. We're activating something that hasn't been active in millennia." The camera focuses on the centre of the chamber, showing a raised circular platform about 4 meters in diameter. The platform is made of the same glowing stone as the walls, with inscriptions arranged in concentric circles radiating from a depression in the exact centre. The depression is shaped vaguely like a handprint, but with 7 distinct contact points instead of 5, arranged in a pattern that doesn't match human anatomy. Each contact point is about 3 centimeters deep, smooth-sided, clearly intentional. Monroe moves into frame, approaches the platform carefully, examining the depression without touching it. "This is an interface," she says, "a control mechanism, but designed for something with different hands than humans, different number of digits, different proportions." "Don't touch it," Reeves says from behind the camera. "We don't know what it does, what it might activate." "I'm not going to," Monroe says, but she leans closer, examining the inscriptions around the depression. These symbols, they're instructions, sequential steps for operating something, and they reference the timing, the cycles, the return of... Oh God! Suddenly a low-frequency hum fills the audio, deep enough that it's probably felt more than heard, vibrating through the stone and the air, resonating in frequencies that make the camera shake slightly even though Monroe's hands are steady. The inscriptions on the walls brighten significantly, the blue glow intensifying and spreading through the carved channels like liquid flowing through irrigation canals, filling in patterns that weren't visible before, lighting up in sequence as if energy was moving through specific pathways. The hum increases in pitch and intensity, becoming almost musical, overtones harmonizing in ways that sound deliberately arranged, mathematically precise. The light flows toward the ceiling, concentrating on a central point directly above the platform where the walls curve to meet. The symbols arrange themselves into a configuration, a specific pattern that wasn't visible before when the inscriptions were inactive. The image is familiar, iconic even. The winged disc, the symbol seen on countless Sumerian tablets and Babylonian monuments, the representation of the Anunnaki's divine authority. But here it's not carved or painted. It's formed by light, by active energy, by a system that's functioning after being dormant for an incomprehensible length of time. The wings spread across the ceiling, geometric and regular, the central disc glowing brighter than the surrounding symbols, pulsing faster now, 4 or 5 times per second. "Oh God," Monroe's voice says, backing away from the platform. "We activated it. Marcus, if you're seeing this, we activated the beacon. We found the interface, and just being here, just entering this chamber, was enough to wake it up. They know we're here, they know we've found it. The system is transmitting." The light continues intensifying, the hum growing louder and more complex, layers of frequency stacking on each other in patterns that suggest information encoding, data transmission, a signal being sent through some medium that isn't apparent. The camera jerks as Reeves starts moving, backing toward what must be the entrance to the chamber. "We need to leave. We need to document this and get out before someone notices. If Arkan is monitoring this area, they'll know the beacon activated." But Monroe doesn't move immediately. She's staring at the ceiling, at the glowing winged disc, transfixed by what she's seeing. "It's not a warning," she says quietly, almost to herself. "It's an invitation. The beacon isn't saying stay away, it's saying we're ready. We're ready for you to come back." The video cuts to black abruptly, leaving only audio. Sound of rapid breathing, footsteps on stone echoing in enclosed space, the hum still audible, but starting to fade as they move away from the chamber. Monroe's voice one more time, distant and echoing. The inscriptions describe the timing. 43 cycles since the beginning, each cycle 3,600 years. That's roughly 155,000 years since they first came. But the beacon triggers when humans reach sufficient development to find it and activate it. We just told them we're ready for the next phase. Then nothing. Static hiss of dead audio. The file ends. Conclusion. The pattern complete. So what does all of it mean? What are we supposed to do with this information? Let's lay out what we know, what can be documented, what's supported by leaked evidence and suppressed research that can be traced and verified by anyone willing to do the work. Multiple archaeological sites across the Middle East have yielded discoveries suggesting advanced knowledge that predates known human civilization. These discoveries have been systematically classified or suppressed by government agencies and private contractors acting in coordination. The pattern is consistent. Discovery, documentation, shutdown, silence. Eridu, Harran, Tel Brak, Susa, and others all following the same sequence. Ancient texts from Sumerian, Akkadian, and related cultures describe the Anunnaki not as spiritual beings, but as physical entities with technical knowledge, who created humans through processes that read like genetic engineering when translated carefully and literally. The texts specify ratios, binding pairs, sequential procedures that correlate with modern genetic science in ways that shouldn't be possible for ancient writers working with primitive understanding. Modern genetic research programs, classified and operating under cover of medical research, are using information extracted from these ancient texts to modify human genetics according to ancient template specifications. The Genesis 2 project exists, its documentation is real, and its objectives include human enhancement based on ancient genetic codices recovered from archaeological sites. Astronomical observations suggest possible gravitational anomalies in the outer solar system, consistent with a large planetary body in a highly elliptical orbit, though the data is ambiguous enough that reasonable skepticism is warranted. The orbital parameters loosely match ancient predictions about a wandering planet that returns periodically. Underground installations have been discovered in Iraq containing technology that shouldn't exist, devices made from manufactured extraterrestrial alloys that remain functional after thousands of years of burial, transmitting signals or maintaining readiness for purposes unknown. That's the documented reality, the evidence that exists regardless of how we interpret it. The skeptical explanation remains available. Coincidence, misinterpretation, pattern matching by investigators who wanted to find connections and therefore found them. The ancient texts are mythology being overinterpreted. The genetic research is legitimate medical science, with connections to archaeology being exaggerated. The astronomical data is instrumental error. The underground technology is misidentified natural formations or modern installations mistaken for ancient ones. Everything could be explained away if you're committed to conventional narratives and uncomfortable with extraordinary possibilities. But what if it's not? What if every piece of evidence is genuine? What if the Anunnaki were real, physical beings who came to Earth from somewhere else, who understood genetics and engineering in ways that seemed like magic to primitive humans who witnessed their work, who created humanity for specific purposes through deliberate modification of existing species? Then the implications reshape everything we think we know about ourselves. Human history isn't what we've been taught. We're not the product of purely natural evolution, or at least not entirely. We're designed, engineered, created by beings with capabilities far beyond what our ancestors could comprehend. Those beings documented their work in texts that survived as mythology, preserved through countless retellings and translations because the information was too important to lose completely. They left installations, buried technology, monitoring systems that could remain dormant for thousands of years and reactivate when the right conditions were met. The conditions being humans developed enough to find the installations, understand what they were looking at, and trigger the systems that would signal our creators that we'd reached sufficient sophistication. We call them myths because it's easier than calling them memories. Because accepting them as memories means accepting that everything we think we know about human origin and human nature might be incomplete at best, deliberately obscured at worst. It means accepting that we might not be alone in the universe, and that we never have been. That we're part of something larger, an operation that spans thousands of years from humanity's creation to our present moment, all building toward purposes we're only beginning to comprehend. And the scariest part? We might have just activated the signal that tells them to come back. The sealed chamber under Eridu exists. The inscriptions are real, carved by people with knowledge that predates any known civilization. The beacon, if that's what it is, was dormant until human investigators entered that space and triggered systems that had been waiting for exactly that moment. Monroe and Reeves found it. They activated it. They documented what happened and sent one final message before vanishing. Were they captured by Archon personnel monitoring the site? Are they being held somewhere, prevented from revealing what they discovered? Are they dead? Casualties of knowing too much and threatening powerful interests that want this information suppressed? Or are they somewhere else entirely? Somewhere underground in chambers lit by blue circuits carved in ancient stone, waiting with whatever they found there for the signal to be answered, for the creators to return and complete whatever plan has been unfolding since the beginning. The Eridu excavation remains officially sealed, classified under a multinational directive that hasn't been explained or justified to anyone outside the agencies involved. Archon Geo Solutions continues operating in Iraq, their activities hidden behind corporate privacy and government classification, their purpose known only to senior personnel with appropriate clearances. Genesis 2 continues its work, publishing occasional papers about genetic medicine, while pursuing objectives that remain classified, following ancient instructions to redesign humanity according to specifications left by our creators. And something might be approaching from the outer solar system, massive and distant, following an orbit that brings it close to Earth, on a schedule measured in thousands of years, close enough to matter. Close enough to allow whoever or whatever created us to return and check on their work. Daniel Reeves and Rachel Monroe remain missing. Officially, there's no evidence of foul play, no reason to suspect anything beyond two adults choosing to disappear. Their families still hope they'll come home. Investigators have found nothing. Officially, nothing unusual happened in Iraq in 2024. Officially, the Anunnaki are mythology, ancient stories told by primitive people trying to make sense of a confusing world. Officially, humanity evolved naturally through millions of years of random mutation and natural selection. No intervention required, no outside influence needed to explain our consciousness or capabilities. Officially, we're alone. We've always been alone. And the gods who shaped us from clay are nothing more than stories. But late at night, when you're drifting off to sleep, when the rational mind loosens its grip and older instincts surface, maybe you'll wonder. Maybe you'll think about the winged disc carved on tablets 5,000 years old, glowing in underground chambers that haven't been opened in millennia. Maybe you'll think about the impossible precision of ancient structures, the sophisticated knowledge encoded in cuneiform that nobody should have possessed, the stories every civilization tells about gods who came from the sky and made humans in their image. Maybe you'll look up at the stars and wonder what's out there in the dark, beyond Neptune and Pluto, in the cold reaches where orbits take thousands of years to complete. Maybe you'll wonder if something is coming closer, making its slow, inevitable approach toward the inner solar system, toward the planet where its creation waits. Maybe you'll wonder if we were designed to wonder, if curiosity itself is part of the program, if every question we ask brings us closer to the answers they left for us to find when we were finally sophisticated enough to understand them. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realise that the beacon has already been activated, that the signal has already been sent, that we've announced ourselves to whoever created us, told them we've reached the development level they were waiting for, triggered the systems they left to monitor our progress. The Anunnaki aren't coming back. They're already here. They've always been here, waiting in chambers beneath Eridu and Göbekli Tepe, and a dozen other sites along the arc of ancient Mesopotamia, sleeping in technology we mistake for ancient stone, encoded in the very DNA that makes us human, preserved in texts we dismissed as mythology for thousands of years, waiting for us to be ready, waiting for us to find them, waiting for us to fulfill whatever purpose they designed us for when they shaped the clay and called it human, and set us on a path that led inevitably to this moment. Phase 4 is coming. The return signal has been sent, and we're about to discover what we were actually created. For all those thousands of years ago, when beings from somewhere else decided Earth needed a workforce designed to specifications they could control. Sweet dreams. Before we begin, If you're enjoying this story and want to support the channel in a way that helps more than you could possibly know, please consider using your hype points on this video. It makes a massive difference in helping us reach more people who love these kinds of mysteries, and if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. No pressure, but we really do enjoy connecting with all of you out there in the dark, wherever you are. Now, let's begin. The call came through at 3:47 in the morning, not to my phone, to my computer, through a chat program I hadn't opened in 6 years. The message was simple: you found it. Now you need to forget it. No profile picture, no username, just a string of random characters that looked like corrupted data. I stared at the screen in my dark apartment, the only light coming from my monitor and the distant glow of streetlights through half-closed blinds. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. I'd been awake for 31 hours straight, deep in a rabbit hole I'd promised myself I'd never go down again. The John Titor case. And now someone knew I'd found something. Something that proved the most famous time traveller in internet history might have actually been real. Prologue. The night that started everything, December 14, 2000. Late night. Coast to coast AM. I was 19 years old, living in a studio apartment in Tucson, working night shifts at a 24-hour copy centre. Insomnia had been my companion since childhood, and Art Bell's radio show had become my nightly ritual. The strange, the unexplained, the absolutely bizarre. Art covered it all with that signature gravelly voice that made even the most outlandish claims sound plausible. That night started like any other. I had the radio playing low while I reorganised my comic book collection, a mountain of back issues threatening to avalanche off my desk. Art was taking calls, the usual mix of UFO sightings and government conspiracy theories, when he mentioned something that made me stop mid-action. "We've been getting some interesting emails," Art said, that curious tone entering his voice, the one he used when something genuinely intrigued him. "From someone claiming to be posting on internet forums. Says he's a time traveller from the year 2036. I set down the comic I was holding, an old X-Files tie-in issue, and turned up the volume. Art continued. "He's been posting since November, apparently. Calls himself John Titor. Says he's here on a military mission." There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. Let me read you what he wrote. Quote, "I am here on a military mission. My time machine is a stationary mass temporal displacement unit." End quote. The words hung in the air of my tiny apartment. I'd heard hundreds of times, traveller claims on coast to coast over the years. They usually fell apart within minutes. Vague predictions, convenient excuses, obvious attention seekers. But something about this one felt different. The terminology, the specificity, the claim of a military mission rather than some grand save-the-world scenario. I grabbed a notebook and started writing down everything Art said. That night I became a John Titor follower. Just a fan, like thousands of others. I had no idea that 23 years later I'd uncover something that would make me wish I'd never heard that broadcast. Act 1. The original investigation, Chapter 1. Coast to Coast, an archive. Dive. Fast forward to November 2023. I'm 42 years old now. Still an insomniac. Still listening to Coast, though George Nuri hosts it now. Art Bell retired years ago and passed away in 2018, taking with him one of the most unique voices in radio history. I work as a data analyst for an insurance company, a job that pays well enough but leaves my mind understimulated. I spend my nights the way I spent them in 2000, diving into mysteries, reading forums, chasing threads that lead nowhere. But I hadn't touched the John Titor case in over a decade. It had been solved, more or less. Debunked, depending on who you asked. The general consensus was that Titor was an elaborate hoax, possibly connected to a Florida lawyer named Larry Haber, though nothing was ever proven. The predictions didn't come true. No American Civil War in 2005, no worldwide Olympics after 2004, no radical restructuring of society by 2015. Case closed. Move on. Except, I couldn't stop thinking about something I'd noticed years ago. Something that nagged at the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. The audio. I'd saved copies of the coast-to-coast broadcasts where Art Bell discussed Taita. 3 main episodes. January 12, 2001, the most famous appearance. January 15, 2001, the follow-up. And an open line night where multiple callers claimed Taita had contacted them privately. On a Wednesday night in early November, unable to sleep despite trying for 4 hours, I decided to listen to them again. Not for nostalgia, for something I remembered hearing but never investigated. I put on my headphones, opened the audio files, and started with the January 12 broadcast. Art's voice filled my ears, warm and welcoming, introducing the topic of time travel, then playing clips of someone claiming to be John Titor responding to questions, reading his posts aloud. I listened to the entire episode normally the first time through. Then I listened again with audio editing software open, frequency analysis running, sound isolated into different channels. That's when I heard it clearly for the first time, behind Art's voice, underneath the normal phone line static and compression artifacts of early 2000s radio broadcasting. There was a hum, a steady rhythmic hum that pulsed at irregular intervals. I isolated it, amplified it, ran it through spectral analysis. The hum wasn't random. It had structure, peaks and valleys at specific frequencies, and underneath that something else, a clicking pattern that repeated every 7 seconds. It sounded eerily similar to old modem handshake protocols, but deeper, more complex. I logged it in a document. Anomalous audio signature in Taita broadcasts. Possible line interference or encoding artifact. Further investigation needed. At the time, I assumed it was just technical interference. Phone lines in 2000 weren't exactly high fidelity. Radio broadcasts went through multiple stages of compression and transmission. It could have been anything, but I kept listening. Chapter 2. John Titor's Real Claims. Over the next week, I went deeper than I'd ever gone before. I compiled every single post John Titor made to the forums where he originally appeared. Time Travel Institute and the old Art Bell post-to-post forums, both archived now but still accessible if you knew where to look. Titor's first post appeared on November 2nd, 2000, under the name timetravel_0. He described himself as an American soldier from the year 2036, sent back in time on a military mission to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer from 1975. The computer, he claimed, was needed to debug legacy Unix systems that would become critical in his timeline's future. His story was detailed, disturbingly detailed. He described his time machine, a C204 temporal displacement unit manufactured by General Electric. He posted technical diagrams showing a gravity distortion system using dual microsingularities held in magnetic suspension. He explained how the device worked, using terms like Kerr black holes and quantum field manipulation. He talked about his timeline's history, how a civil conflict would begin in America in 2005 following civil unrest and federal overreach, how it would escalate into a full civil war by 2008, how Russia would launch a nuclear strike in 2015, killing millions but ultimately leading to a simplified community-based society by 2036. He described life in his time, no internet as we knew it, decentralized communities, manual labour and agriculture being primary occupations, technology that was advanced in some ways but deliberately limited in others to prevent centralised control. He answered hundreds of questions, some scientific, some personal, some trying to trip him up. And when predictions didn't match our reality, when 2005 came and went without civil war, when the Olympics continued past 2004, when the nuclear strike didn't happen in 2015, Titor's defenders had a ready answer, because Titor himself had provided it. Many timelines exist, he'd written. Mine may not be yours. My presence here may have already altered events. or you may simply exist on a different world line than the one I departed from. It was the perfect escape clause, unfalsifiable, impossible to disprove because any discrepancy could be explained by timeline divergence. Genius if you were running a hoax, terrifying if you weren't. I read through everything again with fresh eyes, and I noticed patterns I'd missed before. Tita never made predictions that could be immediately verified. He spoke about things years in the future, always leaving enough gap time that verification was impossible in the moment. He answered technical questions with impressive detail, but always with enough vagueness that experts couldn't definitively say he was wrong. And he never, ever provided proof that couldn't be explained away, except for one thing, the physics. Several theoretical physicists had analysed Tita's explanations of time travel mechanics. While much of it was speculative, some of his descriptions of rotating black hole physics and closed time-like curves were remarkably sophisticated for a random internet poster in 2000. Not impossible for someone well read in theoretical physics to fake, but impressive nonetheless. One researcher noted that Tita's description of temporal acceleration matched some classified DARPA research that wasn't publicly known until 2004. How did a hoaxer know that in 2000? I added it to my notes, filed it under Interesting but Inconclusive. Chapter 3. The Haber Connection. Every investigation into John Tita eventually led to the same place. Larry Haber, an entertainment lawyer in Florida. The connection was discovered around 2009 by a group of dedicated researchers who traced internet records, domain registrations, and communication patterns. They found that the Tita family's communications, after John stopped posting in March 2001, were allegedly handled by Haber's legal office. Haber and his brother, Maury, were somehow connected to the Tita Foundation, an organisation that claimed to represent the Tita family. The foundation sold a book compiling Tita's posts, and even shopped around a movie deal at one point. The Haber brothers never confirmed or denied involvement in creating the Tita story. They maintained that they simply represented the interests of the time traveller's family, specifically his mother, who supposedly wanted to protect her son's identity. It was all very convenient and very suspicious. Over the years, researchers had tried to definitively prove the Haber connection. Some claimed success, others hit dead ends. The general consensus in the skeptical community was that one or both Haber brothers, possibly with accomplices, had created the entire Tita persona as either an elaborate art project or a potential media property. Case closed, right? I decided to reach out anyway. I found Larry Haber's law office contact information, still operating, still listed in Florida, and sent a carefully worded email. I identified myself as a researcher looking into the cultural impact of the John Tita story, asked if he'd be willing to discuss his involvement in representing the Tita family, and assured him I was approaching this from an academic perspective rather than as a debunker. 3 weeks passed, no response. I followed up, still nothing. On the 4th week, I got a reply, but not from Haber. The email came from an address I didn't recognise. The subject line read, "Regarding your Tita inquiry." The message itself was brief. Some cases are closed for a reason. Let this one stay buried. No signature, no explanation. I tried to reply. The email bounced back. Address didn't exist. I should have stopped there. Act 2. The clue no one ever followed. Chapter 4. The lost interview tape. I've always had a weakness for old electronics. Ham radios, vintage computers, obsolete media formats. There's something appealing about technology from eras when things were built to last, when you could take apart a device and actually understand how it worked. That's why I found myself at a ham radio swap meet in Phoenix on a Saturday morning in late November. It was held in a community centre parking lot. Card tables loaded with vintage equipment, cables, antique radios, and boxes of components salvaged from who knows where. I was browsing a table of old broadcast equipment when a man next to me said, "You look like someone who appreciates the old stuff." I glanced over. He was probably in his late 60s, weathered face, wearing a trucker cap with a faded CB Radio Club logo. His table was mostly vintage CB equipment and cassette tapes of radio broadcasts. "Guilty," I said. "There's something about equipment from before everything became computerized." "Everything had character back then," he agreed. "Even the static sounded better." He chuckled at his own joke. "Name's Bill Anders. Ethan Ward." We shook hands. His grip was firm, the handshake of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with his hands. "You collect broadcast tapes?" he asked, gesturing to his collection. "Sometimes. Depends what's on them." Bill studied me for a moment, then said something that made my stomach tighten. "You ever listen to Coast AM?" "All the time," I said carefully. "Been listening since the 90s. Art Bell fan?" "He was the best." Bill nodded slowly. Then he leaned in slightly and lowered his voice. "Then you might be interested in something I've got. Something that never aired." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What do you mean?" "Art Bell recorded an unaired call," Bill said. "From John Teeter. You know who that is?" My heart started racing. I kept my expression neutral. "The time traveller guy. Sure." "The studio. Then cut out before it could air," Bill continued. "Happened sometimes with Art's setup, especially with weird calls that came through on specific frequencies. Producers usually destroyed recordings of dropped calls, but this one..." He trailed off, looking around the swap meet casually. "This one somebody leaked. I got a copy on cassette." "From who?" I asked. "Someone who worked at the station, friend of a friend. Died about 5 years back. I've been holding on to it. Never knew what to do with it. Figured most people wouldn't care. But you..." He looked at me with sharp eyes. "You look like someone who'd care." "Why are you telling me this?" Bill shrugged. "Getting old. Want to pass things on to people who'll appreciate them. And honestly, the tapes always creep me out a little. Rather have it in someone else's hands." He reached under his table and pulled out a plastic case with a cassette inside. The label was handwritten in faded ink. C2CAM, Tighter Call, Never Broadcast. "How much?" I asked. $20. I handed him the money so fast I nearly fumbled my wallet. Chapter 5. Audio Analysis. I didn't even wait until I got home. I stopped at a Goodwill on the way back and bought a cassette player for $8, drove to a parking lot and sat in my car with my laptop and a cassette to USB adapter I kept in my emergency kit for exactly these kinds of moments. The tape hissed to life. Art Bell's voice came through first, that familiar cadence. "We have a caller on line 4 who says he has information about the temporal displacement claims. Go ahead, caller." Static. Then a voice. Distorted, like it was being filtered through something. Not dramatically altered, but wrong somehow. Like listening to someone talk through a bad connection. But the wrongness wasn't in the quality, it was in the sound itself. "Art, this is John Teeter," the voice said. "I need to clarify something about the device specifications." "Go ahead, John, we're listening." The voice continued, explaining something technical about the C204 unit's power requirements. But I barely heard the words. I was focused on the background. That hum. The same one I'd heard in the aired broadcasts, but clearer, much clearer. And there was more. An electronic sound layered beneath it. Not random static. Something structured. The call lasted maybe 90 seconds before the line went dead. Art's voice returned. "Lost the caller. Let's go to line 6. I sat in my car and listened to the tape 4 more times. Then I drove home, transferred it to digital, and opened it in professional audio editing software. I spent the next 12 hours analysing that 90-second clip. First, I isolated the background sounds from the voice. Then I ran spectral analysis on the hum. Then I focused on the electronic noises underneath. What I found made me physically uncomfortable. The hum wasn't phone line interference. It was too clean, too structured. It pulsed at exact 7-second intervals with frequency variations that followed a mathematical pattern. When I graphed it, the pattern looked like a sine wave passing through a quantum probability field. Something I'd seen in papers about experimental physics, but never in audio recordings. The electronic sounds were even stranger. They resembled encrypted packet bursts, but deeper and more complex than anything used in commercial communications in 2000. When I ran them through frequency analysis, they contained patterns that matched military-grade encryption from the 1980s. specifically the kind used in classified communication systems that were only partially declassified in the late 90s. These sounds shouldn't exist on a phone line in 2000. They definitely shouldn't exist on a call to a radio show. I needed a professional opinion, but I couldn't risk asking anyone in my professional network. Too many questions, too much potential exposure. I found a freelance audio analyst on a forensics forum, someone who advertised their services for legal cases and took anonymous clients. I created a burner email address, sent him the file with no context, and asked for a technical analysis of the background anomalies. I paid via cryptocurrency. 3 days later, he responded, "This is unusual. The hum pattern matches nothing in standard telecommunications. The encryption bursts are definitely military grade, similar to protocols used in classified systems from the Cold War era." But here's what's really strange. This wasn't made on any consumer equipment available in 2000. The encoding quality suggests professional grade hardware, possibly military issue. Where did you get this? And why are you asking about it? I didn't respond. The analyst sent 2 more emails over the next week, increasingly insistent. I need to know where this came from. If this is evidence in a criminal case, I'm obligated to report it. Please respond. I deleted the email account. Ached 3. The Modern Thread. Chapter 6. A new title message. November 2nd, 2023. Exactly 23 years after John Titor's first post. I was at work, mindlessly processing insurance claims, when my phone buzzed with a notification I'd set up years ago. An alert that triggered whenever someone mentioned John Titor on certain forums and boards I monitored. Most alerts were false positives, people discussing the old case, sharing theories, nothing new. But this one was different. The alert came from an obscure time travel discussion board that had maybe 20 active users, the kind of place conspiracy theorists went to die quiet deaths of obsession. I opened the page on my phone. A new account had been created that morning. Username timetravel_2036. It had made exactly 1 post, time-stamped at 3:14 a.m. Ethan Ward, stop digging. This is not your timeline to fix. My hands went numb. I read it again. Then again. My name. My actual name. On a forum I'd never posted on under my real identity. I'd always used aliases when discussing Titor online, careful to never connect my real identity to my research. How did someone know I was investigating? I checked the user profile, created 3 hours ago. No other information, no email listed, no avatar. I clicked on the username to see if there were any other posts. The profile page loaded, account deleted. The post was still there, but the user no longer existed. I screenshot everything, my heart hammering. Then I did something I should have known better than to do. I tried to trace the IP address. The forum had open source server logs available to moderators, and with the right tools, anyone who knew where to look. I found the entry for that post. The IP address was registered to White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. I stared at my screen, certain I'd made a mistake. I ran the trace again. Same result. White Sands. A major military installation. One that happened to be involved in advanced physics research and experimental technologies. I decided to dig deeper. I used a more sophisticated tracking tool, one that showed the path the connection took before posting. That's when things got truly bizarre. The connection originated from White Sands. Then it jumped to CERN in Geneva, Switzerland. Then it vanished completely. No exit node, no further trace, nothing. It simply terminated in the middle of transmission in a way that shouldn't be technically possible. I sat at my desk, surrounded by mundane insurance paperwork, and felt reality tilt slightly off its axis. Someone at White Sands, or someone using their network infrastructure, had posted a message to a forgotten forum telling me specifically to stop investigating John Titor, and they'd routed it through CERN, one of the world's premier particle physics laboratories, the place where they smash atoms and study the fundamental nature of reality, the place where some conspiracy theorists believe time travel research might actually be conducted. Chapter 7. Contact from a coast-to-coast insider. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment with every light on, periodically checking the forum to see if the message was still there or if I'd imagined the whole thing. It was still there. Username deleted, IP trace impossible to run again because the logs had been wiped. At 2:37 a.m, my phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Ethan Ward? A woman's voice, older, tired sounding. Who is this? My name is Amy Jacobs. I used to produce for Coast to Coast AM back when Art was still hosting. I heard you've been asking questions about John Titor. My mouth went dry. How did you hear that? Because I've been monitoring Titor-related searches for 15 years, she said, and you just triggered about 8 different alerts I set up. You found something, didn't you? I don't know what you mean. The audio. You found the anomaly in the audio. Silence stretched between us. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. How do you know about that? I finally asked. Because Art found it too, Amy said. Years ago, before he retired. He never talked about it publicly, but he knew something was wrong with those broadcasts. He asked me to analyse them. I found the same thing you did. The hum, the encryption patterns, everything. And then we started getting inquiries from people who shouldn't have been interested. Defence contractors, government agencies, someone from a place in Virginia that wouldn't identify themselves directly but was clearly intelligence community. They requested all Titor-related correspondence, all the tapes, all the caller information we had. Did you give it to them? We didn't have a choice. They had paperwork, official requests. Art was furious, but there was nothing he could do. I started pacing my apartment. Why are you calling me? Because you found something we didn't. You got further than we did, and I think you're in danger of stumbling onto something that powerful people want to stay hidden. What did Art think it was? Amy was quiet for a long moment. Art believed a Titor wasn't posting from 2000. He believed Titor was broadcasting into 2000, from somewhere else, someone else. That's impossible. Is it? Explain the encryption patterns. Explain the quantum acoustic signature. Explain how someone in 2000 had information about classified research that wasn't public yet. She paused. Ethan. Art spent the last years of his life quietly investigating this. He never went public because he couldn't prove anything, and because he was scared of what it meant. What did it mean? It meant someone had figured out how to communicate backwards through time, and they were testing it on the most public platform possible, hiding the truth in plain sight, wrapped in conspiracy theory and internet culture, so that anyone who actually believed it would be dismissed as a lunatic. I sat down heavily on my couch. Why would they do that? I don't know, but Art had a theory. He thought Titor's mission wasn't to convince the public of anything. It was to calibrate something, to send controlled messages into the past and measure the effects, to ensure certain future events occurred or were avoided, and Coast to Coast AM, with its global reach and eclectic audience, was the perfect testing ground. That's insane. Is it? Amy asked. You found military-grade encryption in a phone call from 2000. You got a message telling you to stop digging from someone using a military installations network. You're telling me that's normal. I couldn't argue with that. I'm sending you something, Amy said. A file Art gave me before he died. He made me promise to only share it. If someone actually got close to figuring this out, check your email in 5 minutes. Wait! But she'd already hung up. Acket 4. The Conspiracy Twist, Chapter 8. The Fort Meade File. The email arrived exactly 5 minutes later. No message, just an attachment. A scanned PDF labelled Fort Meade Analysis, Titor Case, Classified. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The document was a DARPA memo dated March 2003. Most of it was redacted, black bars covering entire paragraphs. But enough remained to be absolutely terrifying. The header read, Subject, Temporal Communication Leakage, Case Study, Titor Broadcast. The visible portion stated, Signals analysed from Coast to Coast AM, broadcast dated January 2001, show anomalous patterns consistent with temporal offset interference. Frequency analysis reveals quantum acoustic signatures that match predicted outputs from Project Looking Glass prototype systems tested between 1997 and 2000. Conclusion: the subject known as John Titor was either in possession of or in proximity to a temporal displacement device during broadcast transmissions. The signals are consistent with quantum entanglement communication across temporal barriers. Calls correlated with anomalies monitored by NSA's Project Looking Glass observation posts during the same time period, showing temporal probability fluctuations that suggest active manipulation of timeline causality. Recommendation: reclassify case under SAP protocols. Monitor all further Titor-related communications. Suppress public investigation through disinformation and discrediting campaigns. Transfer file oversight to redacted under satellite research contract cover designation. The document was stamped classified and bore the seal of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. I read it 5 times. Then I researched Project Looking Glass. The classified project was partially revealed through leaked documents in the mid-2000s. It allegedly involved using experimental technology to view probable future timelines, based on something called the Burish Papers, and connected to research at S4, a rumoured underground facility near Area 51. Most researchers dismissed it as disinformation or fantasy, but here was an official document, or what appeared to be one, connecting it directly to the John Titor case. Chapter 9. Ethan's Realization. I spent 3 days cross-referencing everything I'd found. The audio anomalies, the DARPA memo, Amy's testimony about Art Bell's investigation, the message from White Sands routed through CERN, the Haber connection in Florida. And I realized something that made every conspiracy theory I'd ever read seem tame by comparison. What if John Titor's entire appearance wasn't about convincing anyone of anything? What if it was never meant to be believed? Think about it from the perspective of someone running a temporal communication experiment. You can't just broadcast a message to the past openly. That would cause panic, investigation, immediate government response. You'd never get clean data. You'd corrupt the entire experiment. But what if you wrapped your message in absurdity? What if you made it part of internet culture, conspiracy theory, entertainment? What if you made it just plausible enough to attract attention, but just outlandish enough that anyone who believed it would be dismissed? You could send signals, test equipment, calibrate temporal communication systems, measure causality effects, all while hiding in the noise of the late-night radio and internet forums. Coast to Coast AM was perfect for this. A show dedicated to fringe topics, with a global audience of people predisposed to believe in the strange and unexplained. Broadcast late at night when critical thinking is lower and imagination runs higher. Archived for future reference, but dismissed by mainstream culture. John Titor wasn't trying to warn us of the future. John Titor was calibrating a device, testing whether messages could be sent backward through time and be received intact, ensuring that specific information reached specific points in the timeline, creating a documented test case that could be analysed later to refine the technology. And the predictions that didn't come true, those weren't failures, those were the point. By making predictions that could be explained away with different timelines, Titor ensured that the case would never be definitively solved. It would remain in a state of quantum uncertainty, both real and fake simultaneously, depending on who you asked. The perfect cover for experimental temporal communication technology. I sat in my dark apartment and realised I'd stumbled onto something that was never meant to be understood, until whoever sent the messages wanted it understood. Act 5. The Final Contact. Chapter 10. Ethan receives coordinates. The message appeared on my computer screen at 3:47 a.m. on December 10th, 2023. My computer was off, fully shut down. I'd turned it off hours earlier and unplugged it from the internet, paranoid after everything I'd discovered. But when I woke up to use the bathroom, I saw light coming from my office. My monitor was on, displaying a message in plain text on a black background. You have seen too much. If you want the truth, come to these coordinates. Below the message, latitude and longitude coordinates. My skin went cold. I hadn't imagined the impossible. My computer had turned itself on somehow, despite being physically disconnected from power and network. I grabbed my phone and entered the coordinates into a map application. Gainesville, Florida. A residential address in a suburban neighbourhood. I pulled up the street view. A modest house with a small yard. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that screamed temporal research facility or government conspiracy. But I recognised the area. I'd seen it before in my research. It was near where Larry Haber lived, the lawyer connected to the Titer Foundation, and according to the original Titer posts, it was near the coordinates where John Titer claimed he would return home before leaving our timeline in March 2001. The message on my computer screen flickered. Then new text appeared. You have 48 hours. Come alone. Bring the tape. This is not a request. The screen went black. My computer wouldn't turn back on. Chapter 11. The Empty House. I should have called the police. I should have called Amy. I should have done anything except what I actually did. But I've never been good at making smart decisions when curiosity is involved. I booked a flight to Florida that morning. Red-eye departure, arriving in Gainesville just after dawn. I brought the cassette tape in my carry-on, wrapped in bubble wrap and tucked into a padded case. The house matched the street view images perfectly. Small, single-story, beige siding, brown roof. A for sale sign in the front yard, faded and crooked like it had been there for months. No cars in the driveway. No signs of occupancy. I sat in my rental car across the street for 20 minutes watching. No movement, no lights, nothing. Finally, I walked up to the front door. It was unlocked. The interior was empty. Completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, no indication anyone had lived there recently. Just bare walls and carpet that still showed vacuum marks from a cleaning service. But in the centre of the living room floor, there was something. A metal cylinder, about 3 feet tall, 2 feet in diameter, covered in what looked like precision-machined components, coils, sensors, small crystalline structures embedded in the casing. It was sitting on a circular base covered in symbols that might have been mathematical equations or might have been something else entirely. Next to it, a piece of paper taped to the floor. I walked over slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The note read, in printed text, "This isn't for your world." I stared at the cylinder. It matched the diagrams John Titer had posted back in 2001. The C204 temporal displacement unit. Or at least something that looked exactly like those schematics. I reached out to touch it, and the room vibrated. Not shaking, not movement. The air itself seemed to vibrate, like reality was suddenly running at the wrong frequency. The hum I'd heard in the audio files filled the space so loud it hurt my teeth. The walls flickered. For just a moment I saw through them, or saw them in a different configuration, different paint colour, different carpet, furniture present where there was none, and then I saw him, standing in the corner of the room wearing what looked like a military-style coat. Dark fabric, heavy duty with patches on the shoulders. One patch was clearly visible. It read, Temporal Recon Division 2036. The figure was shadow-like, not quite solid, like looking at someone through frosted glass. But I could see enough to know it was a person. Male, probably, tall, standing completely still, watching me. We made eye contact, or at least I think we did. It's hard to explain. Looking at him was like looking at someone through water that was flowing in the wrong direction. He raised one hand, not waving, more like a gesture of acknowledgement or warning. Then the vibration stopped. The hum cut off instantly. The room snapped back to normal, empty, quiet, ordinary. The cylinder was gone. The note was gone. I was standing alone in an empty house in Florida, having just experienced something I would never be able to adequately explain. I walked out, got in my rental car, and drove back to the airport. I didn't look back. Epilogue. The case closes itself. I got home to find my computer reformatted. Not wiped, reformatted. Clean operating system installation, all my files gone, including everything related to John Titor. The cassette tape Bill Anders had sold me was blank. I played it front to back, nothing but magnetic hiss. I tried to contact Amy Jacobs. Every phone number I had for her was disconnected. Every email bounced back. I searched for her online and found nothing. No social media, no professional profiles, no obituary, nothing. It was like she'd never existed. I went back to the forum where the message about me had appeared. The post was gone. Not just deleted, gone from the archive, gone from cached versions, gone from the Wayback Machine, like it had never been posted. I checked the Coast to Coast AM archives for the John Titor episodes. Every single one showed as currently unavailable due to rights issues. Art Bell's entire Titor discussion catalogue was inaccessible. I tried to contact Larry Haber again. His law office website was down. His phone number led to a disconnected message. I pulled out the DARPA document Amy had sent me. I opened the file. Blank PDF. 0 pages. Every single piece of evidence I'd collected over 2 months of investigation was gone. Erased. Disappeared like it had never existed. The only thing I had left was my memory. And even that felt uncertain now. Like maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing. Maybe I'd had some kind of breakdown. Maybe the insomnia and the obsession had finally caught up with me, and I'd hallucinated an entire conspiracy. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know what I experienced. And I think I finally understand what John Titor really was. Time travel might not be about visiting the past. It might be about editing it, adjusting the timeline in subtle ways, ensuring certain events occur or don't occur, sending information backward to specific points to calibrate and refine the ability to manipulate causality. And if you can edit the past, you can also edit the present. You can remove evidence, erase records, make sure investigations never happened. I think John Titor, or whoever was behind that name, returned to make sure my investigation disappeared. Not by threatening me, not by silencing me, but by retroactively ensuring I never had anything to investigate in the first place. Which means either I'm crazy, or I'm one of the few people who remembers a version of events that no longer exists in our timeline. I still listen to Coast, still stay up late, unable to sleep, chasing mysteries and conspiracies. But I don't research time travel anymore. I don't dig into classified projects or unexplained phenomena. Because now I know that some cases aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be buried. And sometimes, if you dig too deep, the case buries you instead. If you found yourself listening to this entire story and wanting to know more, I hope you'll use your hype points on the video if you enjoyed it. It genuinely helps the channel in ways you might not realise, and we're grateful for every single one of you who takes the time to support what we do here. Drop a comment if you feel like it. Tell us what time it is where you are, where you're listening from in the world. We love seeing where all of you are tuning in from, across time zones and continents. But more importantly, if you've ever experienced something you can't explain, something that doesn't quite fit with the reality you think you know, maybe keep it to yourself. Some truths aren't meant to be shared. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because in the end, the John Titor case taught me one thing above all else. Reality is more fragile than we think. And sometimes the people who try to understand how fragile it is are the ones who find out just how easily it can be edited, adjusted, and rewritten. I'm Ethan Ward, and this is the case I shouldn't have reopened. Sleep well, everyone, and remember, some timelines are better left unexplored.